Fire swallowed the night. Not one blaze. 3. Under a bruised Kansas sky, the prairie held its silence. Flames climbed the dry hay barn in separate tongues of red, too precise, too deliberate to be accident. Smoke thick enough to choke. Figures running with buckets. A tall shadow at the center shouting orders, fighting the fire the way a man fights a stampede. In the window, a woman stood motionless, rifle tight in her hands, eyes locked on the burning. No bell, no dog, only the crack of wood and a heart beating too loud. Someone had lit this. Someone was still watching, and the fire was only the first word. The morning had come in gray, over the Calloway place, frost thick on the porch rail, and Josephine had stood in the doorway of her own bedroom watching her father fold his good shirt, with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. He hadn't looked at her. Not once. Not while he folded the shirt. Not while he set it on the chair. Not while he said her name low, like a man testing whether a bridge would hold his weight, before he crossed it. Josephine. Papa. You don't have to forgive me for this. His voice cracked on the word forgive, split right down the middle of it. I don't reckon I could forgive myself in your shoes. She hadn't answered. Because there wasn't an answer that wouldn't break one of them clean in half. Because forgiveness wasn't the thing sitting in her chest that morning. It was something colder, something that didn't have a name yet. He'd told her the whole of it 3 weeks before, at the kitchen table, the lamp burning low between them, and his hands wrapped, so tight around his coffee cup she'd thought the tin might buckle. The drought, 2 years running, the note at the bank gone past due, then past due again. And then the letter that had come, not from the bank at all as it turned out, though none of them had known that yet, offering to settle the whole debt. In full. If only Josephine would marry a rancher named Holt Sterling, a man neither of them had ever laid eyes on. I said no. Her father had told her that night. First thing out of my mouth. I said no. But you signed it anyway. He hadn't answered that. Just wept, silent, shoulders shaking. An old man crying at his own kitchen table like a boy, and Josephine had sat across from him with her hands folded in her lap, and understood in that moment that the decision had already been made. Not by her, not really by him either, not in any way that mattered. Made by hunger and by drought, and by a stranger's letter arriving at exactly the moment it would do the most damage. She hadn't cried that night. She'd gone up to bed and lain in the dark and thought, with a strange, cold clarity that frightened her more than tears would have, I am going to marry a man I have never met. And there is nothing in this world I can do about it. Now, 3 weeks later, she stood in a borrowed dress 2 sizes too large, while her father knotted his tie, with trembling fingers, and neither of them said another word about forgiveness, because there wasn't time left for it, and because some things once said only make the leaving harder. He drove her to the church himself. Didn't come inside. I can't, he said at the church steps, not meeting her eyes. I can't watch what I've done to you, Josephine. I'm sorry. I am so sorry. She'd wanted, in that moment, to hate him. She hadn't been able to manage it. Not entirely. Because underneath the anger was something worse. The understanding that he loved her enough to break his own heart doing this, and that love and ruin could live in the very same act side by side, and a person had no say in which one arrived first. She'd walked into the church alone. The church smelled like candle wax and old wood, and something underneath that, something Josephine Calloway couldn't name. Fear, maybe, or the smell fear leaves behind, when it's been sitting in a room too long. She stood at the back of the aisle in a dress that wasn't hers, borrowed from a neighbor, too big in the shoulders. The lace had gone the color of weak tea. She'd counted the floorboards between herself and the door. 14. She could make it in 14 steps, if her legs would move. They wouldn't move, because every pew was full, because Larkspur Crossing, Kansas, population 611, had turned out to watch. Some of them pitied her. Most of them judged her father. All of them whispered low behind gloved hands the way people do when they think a girl standing 20 feet away can't hear a thing. She could hear everything, because a church that size didn't have the walls to hold a secret. because Larkspur Crossing had never had much else to talk about besides who owed who money and who'd married beneath themselves, and today apparently was both at once. Her hands had gone numb around the bouquet. Prairie roses, wilted at the edges, cut that morning by a neighbor woman who'd meant well and hadn't known what else to say. Josie could smell them anyway, faint and sweet under the wax and the dust, and she thought, absurd as it was, that she would never be able to smell a rose again without her stomach turning over. Holt Sterling waited at the altar with his hat in his hands. 34 years old, broadest shoulders in 3 counties, and the deepest pockets too, though nobody in that church was thinking about his shoulders. They were thinking about his money, about what it had bought her. That was the word they were using. She'd heard it twice already walking in. Bought, like she was a length of dress goods off a shelf. She made herself look at him, waited for cruelty in his face, braced for it, found nothing there but stillness, a kind of quiet she didn't understand yet, wouldn't understand for weeks. The minister's voice rolled on, low and steady, the way water rolls, over stone it's worn smooth. Josie barely heard a word of it. Her father wasn't in the church. Couldn't be. He'd said he couldn't watch what his own desperation had made him do, and then he'd stayed home, and she understood that, and she hated him for it, both at once, in the same breath. The bank had come for the land in March. A stranger had come 3 weeks later with a different offer. Pay the debt in full. Marry the girl to Holt Sterling. Her father had wept at the kitchen table. Then he'd said yes anyway. Nobody had asked Josie a single thing. Do you, Josephine and Calloway, take this man? Her throat closed up like a fist. I do, came out cracked, thin as river ice in March. The minister turned to Holt. And do you, Holt Emerson Sterling? I will. Not I do. Not what everyone in that church was leaning forward to hear. I will. Different words. And the murmur that went through the pews sounded like far-off thunder, the kind that makes a person look up at a clear sky and wonder if they imagined it. Josie glanced at him, startled. He hadn't looked at her once, not since she'd come down that aisle. His jaw was set like a man bracing against wind. By the power vested in me, the minister said, I now pronounce you man and wife. The words landed like a door closing, like a lock turning somewhere she couldn't see. Holt turned, offered his arm. She stared at it. This stranger's arm. This stranger who apparently owned her future now, whether either of them had asked for it or not. Her hand hovered. 1 heartbeat. 2. 3. She took it. His grip was careful. Not the grip of a man claiming something. Steadier than that. Quieter. They walked back down the aisle, through a gauntlet of stairs, and outside the October wind came in off the plains sharp enough to cut. He helped her up into the wagon without a word, his hands quick and businesslike at her elbow, and she flinched anyway. Couldn't help it. He noticed, stepped back like he'd touched a hot stove. Name's Holt, he said low, gathering the reins. Reckon you already know that. She nodded, couldn't make herself speak. You all right, Miss Calloway? It's Mrs. Sterling now. The words tasted like ash going down. He didn't answer right away, just clicked to the horses and pointed them west, toward the foothills, and Larkspur Crossing shrank behind them, into a smudge of church steeple and gray rooftops until it was gone altogether. The Sterling Ranch rose up out of the valley floor like something out of a dream she hadn't let herself have. 2 stories of timber and river stone, windows catching the last orange light of the day. A porch that wrapped around 3 sides of the house like an embrace nobody had asked for. Smoke curled up from the chimney, warm, welcoming, which felt like a cruel joke under the circumstances. It was bigger than her father's whole homestead put together. Bigger than anything she'd ever lived inside. Holt helped her down. She stepped away from his hands the second her boots hit the ground. I'll show you through, he said. She followed him up the porch steps and through a door that opened onto warmth, a stone hearth, a braided rug, furniture some careful hand had built, and some careful hand still tended. Wood smoke, coffee. The smell of a house that had been loved once. Kitchen's through there, he said, nodding toward an arched doorway. Pantry's stocked. You need anything, Ezra rides to town Wednesdays. He runs the place with me. She said nothing, just took it in. The size of it, the silence of it. A curtain hung at the front window, faded blue, hand-stitched, the kind of careful work a woman puts into a house she means to live a whole life inside of. Josie noticed it. Noticed, too, the way Holt's eyes skimmed past it, without stopping, the way a person's gaze slides over a scar they've long since stopped feeling, because someone had chosen that curtain once, because someone had hung it and stood back and been pleased with the color against the morning light, and because that someone wasn't in this house anymore and hadn't been for 5 years, and the curtain stayed up anyway, faded a little more with every season like nobody in the household had found it in them, yet to take it down. Josie didn't ask. Not yet. Some things she was already learning a person had to earn the asking of. He led her up a wide staircase, lamps burning low along the hall, and stopped at the second door on the right. This is your room. She stepped inside. A 4-poster bed, a quilt in blue and cream, a washstand, a window facing east so the morning would come to her first, before it came to anyone else in that house. And on the inside of the door, a lock. Holt pointed to it. Didn't reach for it. Just pointed. Use it if you need to, he said. I won't come through that door unless you ask me to. She stared at the lock. Then at him. You understand? Yes. Barely a whisper. He nodded once. There's supper if you're hungry. Then he left, and the door clicked shut behind him. And Josie stood alone in the middle of a stranger's house, with her heart going like a rabbit's. She crossed to the door, turned the lock, heard it click home. Then she sat on the edge of the bed and looked at her own hands like they belonged to someone else. She didn't cry, couldn't. There wasn't room for it yet. Just sat there, while the lamp burned low, and the big house settled, and creaked around her like it was getting used to a new weight in it. Downstairs, Holt ate alone at the kitchen table. 2 plates set out of habit, or hope, hers untouched across from him. He looked at that empty plate a long while. Then he wrapped 2 biscuits in a clean cloth, and carried them up, and set them outside her door without knocking, and went back down and sat by the fire until it burned to embers and didn't sleep much at all. Morning came in gray and cold, frost on the window glass. Josie woke to find the plate still sitting, where he'd left it, biscuits gone cold, but the cloth smelling faintly of lavender, like somebody's mother had folded that linen once. She ate sitting on the edge of the bed, didn't unlock the door yet. Voices drifted up through the floorboards. 2 men. One she recognized as Holt's. Town's already got opinions, boss. That was Ezra Boone. She'd caught a glimpse of him the evening before, crossing the yard. Older man, kind eyes, a grin that looked like it had been crooked since boyhood. Town can keep them, Holt said. Flat. Final. They're saying you got yourself a real bargain. A pause. Long enough that Josie held her breath, without meaning to. She's not a bargain, Holt said. She's my wife. Just saying what I heard. Then stop hearing it. Boots crossed the kitchen floor. A door opened, shut. Silence came back, into the house like water filling a low place. Josie sat with her hand pressed flat against her own door. Listening to nothing now. Thinking about the way he'd said she's my wife. Not like a claim, like a fact he intended to defend. That evening she found fresh bread on the kitchen table, still warm, and she didn't know what to do with the small, unwelcome flicker that lit in her chest at the sight of it. She told herself it meant nothing, because it was easier to believe that than the alternative. Except it did mean something, and some part of her already knew it, even if she wasn't ready to say so. 3 days went by in careful silence. Josie moved through that house like a ghost learning the floor plan of its own haunting. 8 when Holt was out at the barns. Stayed upstairs when his boots sounded in the kitchen. They crossed paths twice. Once in the hall, once on the porch, and both times he stepped aside and nodded and said nothing more than her name. He never pushed, never asked, just left the space open like a gate propped wide, in case she ever wanted to walk through it on her own 2 feet. On the 4th morning she came down, and found him at the table with a ledger open, and coffee steaming in a tin cup, and something in her chest decided, before her mind had caught up to it, that she was tired of eating alone in a room with a locked door. "Morning," he said, didn't look up right away. "Morning." She poured her own coffee. Her hand shook just slightly around the cup. She sat across from him and held on to it like an anchor line in rough water. They sat like that a while. Not comfortable, not hostile either. Just there, the 2 of them, strangers sharing a table because the law said they had to. "Why?" The word was out of her mouth, before she decided to say it. Holt looked up. "Why what? Why did you agree to marry me?" He set his pen down, leaned back in the chair, studied her with those still, unreadable eyes that gave nothing away. Not cruelty, not softness, just attention, like he was trying to read weather in her face. "Man named Garrett Voss came to me 6 weeks back," he said. "Said he had a business arrangement he wanted to put to me, a marriage contract, common enough out here when a family's fallen on hard times, and a rancher's got more house than he's got use for. He told me you were 19, from a good family, said it would benefit both sides." Josie's chest tightened until it hurt. "And you said yes." "I said I'd think on it." He paused. "I'm alone out here, Josephine. This house is too big for one man rattling around in it. Thought maybe it'd be good having someone." "You didn't know." "Know what?" "That I had no choice in it." Something shifted behind his eyes. Surprise first, then something colder, then something that looked almost like shame, though he wasn't the one who ought to have been wearing it. "No," he said quietly, "I didn't know that." So she told him. All of it. The drought that had killed 2 years of crops running. Her father's debts piling up like river stones nobody could move. The bank's notice nailed to the door. And then Garrett Voss arriving like salvation with a debt paid in full, if only her father would sign her name to a marriage contract instead of a foreclosure. "He wept when he told me," Josie whispered. "But he told me anyway." Holt's jaw went tight enough to show the bone beneath it. "And you came. Where else was there for me to go?" Silence again, thicker this time. Holt looked down at his own hands like he was seeing them for the first time. "I'm sorry," he said. She looked up, startled by it. "If I'd known." He stopped himself, shook his head once. "I thought it was mutual, practical arrangement. 2 people who'd agreed to it. When I saw your face at that altar I understood, but it was too late by then to stop it, without shaming you worse than staying quiet would. So you married me anyway." "I did." He met her eyes and didn't look away from what he found there. "And I meant what I said in that church. You're my wife. That doesn't mean I own you." The words settled into the space between them like something small and fragile finding a place to land. Josie felt it. A shift, barely anything, but real. "What would you have done?" she asked, careful. "If you had known." He thought about that a long moment, long enough that she started to regret asking. "Refused the arrangement," he said. "Ridden out to your father myself. Told him there was another way if one existed. There wasn't. I know that now." He turned his coffee cup a slow half circle on the table, not drinking it, just needing something to do with his hands. "Doesn't mean I'm easy about it. Would you send me back? If there was somewhere to send me." "No." The word came out fast, faster than either of them expected, by the look on his own face after he'd said it. "Why not?" she pressed, not accusing, genuinely asking, the way a person asks a question they're half afraid of the answer to. "Because you're not a debt to be settled, Josephine." Whatever Garrett Voss called this arrangement in his letter, whatever the towns decided to call it since. He looked at her steady. "You're a person who got put somewhere she didn't choose. I know something about that myself if you want the truth of it." "What do you mean?" He didn't answer right away. Looked instead toward the window, toward the gray morning light coming up slow, over the north ridge. Another story, he said. For another day. She wanted to press further. Didn't. Some doors, she was learning, opened faster when a person didn't shove. A knock at the door broke it. Ezra, holding out an envelope, from the church ladies' committee. Holt read it, and his face went dark around the edges. "What is it?" she asked. "They want to throw you a welcome social. Sunday." Her stomach dropped clean through the floor. "If we don't go," Holt said, watching her face, "they'll say worse. If we do go, they'll say it to your face instead of behind it." He folded the letter and set it by the stove and didn't burn it, not yet, though she could see in his eyes that he wanted to. That night she left her door open. Not wide, just a crack, enough for the lamplight to spill a thin gold line into the hallway. Holt saw it when he came up the stairs. He paused outside it a long moment, didn't say a word, went on to his own room. But the next morning there was fresh bread on the table again, and this time she ate it across, from him instead of alone. She sat down, that evening, to write her father a letter, and found she didn't know how to start it. "Dear Papa," crossed it out. Too formal, for a man who'd wept at his own kitchen table. "Father," crossed that out too, because what was she supposed to say? "Because I forgive you" felt like a lie she wasn't ready to tell. Not yet, maybe not for a long while yet. "Because I hate you" felt like a worse one, since it wasn't true either, not all the way through, not underneath the anger, that still sat there some mornings like a stone in her shoe. She stared at the blank paper a long while. The lamp burned low beside her. Outside, an owl called once, from the barn roof, and went quiet. "Papa," she finally wrote, "I am well. The house is larger than any I've known, and I confess it frightened me the first night, though it doesn't so much anymore. Mr. Sterling Holt has been kinder than I had any right to expect, from a man I was given to rather than given the choice of." She stopped. Read that line back. Crossed out "given to." Wrote "married" instead, because it was truer, even if it still didn't sit easy in her chest. "I have learned to ride. I have planted tulip bulbs in the garden, for spring, though I could not have told you a month ago that I would still be here to see them bloom. I did not know, until I came here, how much a person could learn about a stranger simply by watching what he does, when he thinks no one is measuring him for it. I am not writing to tell you I have forgiven you, Papa. I don't know yet if I have. Some days I think I might. Other days the thought of that kitchen table and the lamp, and your hands shaking around, that cup, still sits in my chest like something I haven't finished swallowing. But I am not writing to punish you either. I think I only wanted you to know that I am not lost out here. Whatever this marriage began as, it is becoming something else. I don't fully understand it yet myself. Your daughter, Josephine." She read it over twice, nearly tore it up both times. Didn't, in the end, folded it instead careful and set it by the door to give to Ezra come Wednesday, and sat along while after in the lamplight with her hands folded in her lap, feeling lighter than she had in weeks, the way a person feels after finally setting down something heavy they'd forgotten they were still carrying. Because that was the strange truth of it, she thought. Because a person could be angry and grateful in the very same breath, could hate a decision and still somehow begrudgingly thankful for where it had led her. She hadn't expected that, hadn't expected any of this. Not the locked door left open on purpose, not the biscuits gone cold outside her room, not a rancher's steady hands guiding hers around a set of reins. She hadn't expected to feel, 3 weeks into a marriage she'd never asked for, something dangerously close to hope. The social came that Sunday, in the church hall, gingham cloth over the long tables, and lemonade sweating in glass pitchers. Josie wore her one good blouse, pressed twice over, and stood close to Holt's side the whole of the afternoon like a woman standing close to a fire in winter. It wasn't cruel, not outright. That was almost worse, somehow. It was polite in a way that had edges to it. Women asked her where she was from and how she found ranch life, and wasn't it just so convenient, dear, the way things had worked out for her family. Each question landed soft and left a mark anyway, the way a hand can slap without ever raising its voice. "You must be so grateful," said Mrs. Pruitt, the banker's wife, pearl buttons up to her chin, and a voice pitched just loud enough to carry to the next table over. That Mr. Sterling was willing to take on a girl in your family's circumstances. Josie felt the words go into her like a splinter. I'm grateful for my husband, she said, careful even. Not for my circumstances. Mrs. Pruitt's smile thinned. Didn't quite know what to do with that. Beside her, a heavy-set man in a good coat. Her husband, Randall Pruitt, Josie would learn later, the very banker, whose signature sat somewhere on her father's old note. Cleared his throat and studied his lemonade with sudden, deep interest like a man who preferred not to be standing anywhere near his wife's remarks once they'd landed. Reverend Whitfield appeared a moment later, white-bearded, warm-eyed, a plate of cake balanced in one hand. Mrs. Sterling, so glad you could join us. I hope Larkspur Crossing is proving hospitable. Hospitable enough, Reverend, Josie said, and meant it more than half. The Lord does love a fresh start, he said, gentle, and moved on to greet the next family, and Josie found herself grateful for the small kindness of it. One voice in, that hall that hadn't weighed her against a scale of debts and bargains. Holt appeared at her elbow before Mrs. Pruitt could find a second remark to land, a plate of pie in each hand, and the conversation dissolved the way conversations do, when a man the size of Holt Sterling decides to stand in the middle of one. Mrs. Sterling doesn't care for gossip, he said, mild as milk, handing Josie a plate. Neither do I. Of course, Mr. Sterling. Mrs. Pruitt's voice went sweet as spoiled fruit. No offense meant, I'm sure. None taken, Holt said in a tone that made plain exactly how much offense had, in fact, been taken, and steered Josie gently toward the door. They left an hour later, earlier than was polite, and neither of them apologized for it in the wagon on the way home. That was easier than I feared, Josie admitted, once the church steeple had gone small behind them. Holt glanced at her sideways. That was the easy version, Josephine. Don't mistake it for the whole of what this town's capable of. She didn't understand, then, how right he was. Wouldn't understand for a few weeks yet, until a different afternoon, a different room full of women, and no husband standing close enough to hand her a plate of pie before the real cruelty found its footing. 2 weeks moved like water finding the low ground, slow, careful, but steadily forward all the same. Holt rose before light every morning. Josie woke now to the smell of coffee already brewing, and the sound of his boots crossing the porch. He worked the land with Ezra and 2 other hands, mending fence, driving cattle in toward the home pasture, before the first hard freeze. She found her own rhythm too, bread, mending small useful things that gave her hands something to do, while her mind worked its way slowly toward trust. One morning Holt asked, careful, almost shy about it, if she wanted to learn to ride. She hesitated, then nodded. He brought out a bay mare, with a gentle eye, patient as an old church deacon. This is Juniper, he said, steadiest horse on the place. Won't do you wrong. He showed her how to hold the reins, how to sit her weight down, into the saddle instead of perching above it like she meant to fly off. His hands guided hers, careful, never lingering a second longer than the lesson required. The mare shifted beneath her, warm and alive, and something in Josie's chest loosened for the first time in weeks. You're doing fine, Holt said. Juniper nuzzled at her shoulder, soft as a question, and Josie laughed. A startled, real sound that surprised them both. Holt smiled. Small, careful, but a smile. She'd meant the biscuits as a peace offering. That was the whole of the plan. Instead she stood, over a pan of something black and smoking, waving a dish towel at it like a woman trying to flag down a passing train, while Holt stood in the kitchen doorway, with an expression he was clearly fighting hard to keep off his face and losing. It's not funny. Didn't say a word. You're thinking it loud enough I can hear it from here. Josephine. He crossed the kitchen, lifted the pan off the stove with a folded rag, set it in the wash basin, where it hissed and sulked. What exactly were you aiming for? Your mother's biscuits. Ezra said you used to talk about them. Something crossed his face at that. Quick. Gone almost before she caught it. She's been gone a long while. Ezra's got no business handing out recipes he half remembers. Well, he handed out this one, and it clearly wasn't right because I followed it exact, and this is what came of it. Holt leaned over the ruined pan, poked at the contents with one finger, thoughtful like a man examining evidence. You put in flour. Of course I put in flour. How much? The recipe said a cup. A cup of what? Flour. I just said. Josephine. He was fighting the smile again, losing worse this time. Ezra's recipe called for a cup of buttermilk. Not flour. I'd bet the ranch on it. She stared at the pan, stared at him, felt her face go hot in a way that had nothing to do with the stove. That man is going to answer for this. He surely is. Holt was laughing now, low and real, a sound she'd only heard from him twice before and had already decided she wanted to hear a great deal more of. Come on, I'll show you how it's done. Learned it myself, trail cooking out of pure necessity. A man eats his own burnt biscuits often enough, he learns to stop burning them. He stood beside her at the counter, sleeves pushed up, and showed her, patient, unhurried, the way he seemed to do most things. How much flour, how much buttermilk, how gentle a hand needed to be with the dough so it stayed tender instead of turning to stone. Like this. Little lighter touch. I am being light. You're handling that dough like you're wrestling a calf to the ground. I have never wrestled a calf in my life. There's still time, he said, and she swatted flour at him before she decided to do it, and he laughed again, ducking too late, a white handprint left square across his shirt front, and for one whole minute in that kitchen, covered in flour and burnt biscuit smoke, neither one of them was thinking about locked doors or borrowed dresses, or anything at all except the plain, foolish pleasure of learning to be clumsy together. The second batch came out of the oven golden and whole, and they ate them standing up at the counter, still warm, and Josie thought that she had never in her life tasted anything half so fine, though she suspected that had rather less to do with the biscuits than with the company. The days had a shape to them by then, and Josie was starting to learn its edges. Mornings started cold and dark, coffee first, then the sound of Holt's boots on the porch steps. Before the sun had properly cleared the ridge, she'd taken to rising with him, not because he'd asked, because the silence of an empty bed in a house that big had started to feel worse than the work. She learned to gather eggs, without the hens taking a piece out of her hand for it. Learned which pot hung, where in a kitchen that had clearly belonged once to somebody else's careful hands, and she was careful with it in turn, out of a respect she couldn't quite name yet. Learned the sound the windmill made when a storm was coming 2 days out, long before the sky gave any sign of it. One afternoon a hand named Otis got thrown from a green colt and came up limping bad enough that Ezra half carried him into the kitchen and laid him out on the table like a man laying out a Thanksgiving bird. Broke, you figure? Ezra asked, already reaching for a bottle of liniment. Don't know yet. Holt's hands moved, over the ankle, careful, sure. The same steadiness he used on green horses and skittish brides alike. Josephine, bring me strips of that clean linen. And the whiskey. She didn't hesitate, didn't ask why the whiskey, though she suspected and was right. He poured a measure down Otis's throat before he ever touched the swelling, and the hands cursing dropped down to a low, grateful groan instead of a shout. You've done this before? She said, watching Holt wrap the ankle tight, and even corner to corner, like a man who'd learned it the hard way more than once. Trail work'll teach a man plenty he never asked to learn. He didn't look up from the wrapping. Hold his legs steady there, just like that. Her hands were shaking a little the first minute, steadied themselves the longer she held on. And when it was done, and Otis was carried off to sleep it off in the bunkhouse, Holt looked at her a long moment across the kitchen table, blood and liniment on both their hands. You didn't flinch, he said. Not quite a question. Didn't have time to. Something that might have been pride moved behind his eyes. He didn't say it outright, just nodded, once, and went to wash up, and Josie stood there a moment longer than she needed to, feeling something settle into place inside her chest that hadn't been there a month before. Usefulness. The particular, quiet dignity of being needed for something more than a signature on a marriage contract. Later that day, While Holt rode out to check the fence line, Ezra found Josie in the barn, brushing Juniper's coat long, after the mare had any need of it. "He's easier around horses than he is around people," Ezra said, leaning on the stall rail. "Always has been, since he was a boy running drives up out of Texas." Josie looked up. "Drives? Cattle drives. Chisholm Trail back when it was still worth running. Holt was boss of his own outfit by the time he was 22. Youngest trail boss I ever rode under, and I rode under plenty." Ezra's crooked grin came up, remembering something. Man had to bury 2 hands one summer. Storm on the Red River crossing. Never talks about it. Never needed to. You just knew, watching him after, that something in him had gone quiet and stayed quiet. Is that where he made his money? The drives? Some of it. Saved every dollar for 6 years running, while other men drank theirs up in Dodge City the first night off the trail. Bought this land section by section. Built that house with his own hands near enough before he ever married. Ezra paused, studied her a moment, careful, the way a man studies weather, before he decides whether to mention it. Before Anna, Josie went still, the brush stopped mid-stroke against Juniper's flank. "He hasn't spoken of her," she said. "Not once. He will, when he's ready." Ezra straightened, tipped his hat back. "Man like Holt doesn't hand his grief to just anybody, Mrs. Sterling. Means something the day he does." He left her there in the quiet of the barn, the mare's warm breath fogging the cold air, and Josie stood along, while turning that name over in her mind. Anna, wondering what kind of woman she'd been, wondering what kind of silence a man carried, after losing someone that could still be standing guard 5 years on. The storm came up fast on a Thursday, the way storms did out on the plains. No warning at all. Just a sky that decided all at once to turn the color of a bruise and stay that way. Holt was out the door before the first thunder cracked, shouting for Ezra, for the other hands, for anybody with 2 working hands, and a horse under them. Cattle were strung out along the north pasture, close by that same ridge Garrett Voss had looked at with such interest, and a storm like this could scatter a herd clean across 3 counties, if nobody moved fast enough to turn it. "Stay in the house," Holt said, already halfway to the barn. "I can ride. Josephine, I can ride." Chin up, already reaching for her coat. "You taught me yourself. Said I was doing fine." He looked at her one long second, weighing it, weighing, she suspected, a great many things that had nothing to do with horsemanship at all. "Stay behind me," he said finally. "And if I tell you to fall back, you fall back. No arguing it in the middle of a storm. Wouldn't dream of it. You dream of it plenty. Just do it anyway." That pulled something close to a laugh out of her. Quick, startled. Gone the second the wind picked it up and carried it off toward the barn. The next 2 hours went by in a blur of rain, and lightning and shouting, cattle bawling, hooves churning the pasture to mud. Josie rode where Holt pointed her, held the flank he told her to hold, learned, in the space of a single storm, exactly how much trust a person could put in a horse that knew its job better than the rider did. Twice she thought she'd lose her seat entirely. Twice Juniper found her footing anyway, steady under a sky coming apart at the seams. She caught sight of Holt only in flashes, lightning-lit, soaked through, driving a knot of strays back toward the herd, with a rope and a voice gone hoarse from shouting, moving like a man who'd done this exact thing 100 times before. Because he had. Because that was the whole of what a trail boss's life had been once, long before this ranch, this house, this wife he hadn't asked for, and had somehow slowly, without either of them quite marking the day it happened, come to want. By the time the worst of it rolled east, and the rain settled into something merely miserable instead of dangerous, the herd was turned. Counted, mostly whole. Every soul on the Sterling place soaked to the bone, and shaking with cold, and something that might have been triumph. Holt found her back at the barn, unsaddling Juniper with hands gone half numb. "You held," he said, not quite a question, more like he was still getting used to the fact of it. "Told you I could ride." You held in a storm that's put grown men on their backs. He looked at her a long moment, rain dripping off the brim of his hat, mud to his knees, something in his face she hadn't seen from him before. Not the careful stillness, not even the warmth, something closer to plain admiration. Reckon I underestimated you, Mrs. Sterling. Reckon you did. She was too tired and too cold to dress the words up soft. Didn't want to anyway. I'll take the apology in the form of dry firewood and a hot bath, if it's all the same to you. That surprised a real laugh out of him. Short, rough, like a door that hadn't opened in a long while, swinging free on its hinges. Fair terms. They walked back to the house together, through the last of the rain, both of them soaked and mud-streaked and laughing, for one strange, unguarded stretch of minutes, like two people, who had never once stood on opposite sides of a marriage neither had chosen. Ezra watched them go from the barn doorway, said nothing, though the grin on his face lasted the better part of an hour after. That night, drying by the fire, hair still damp, Josie found herself thinking the storm had done something the wedding hadn't, something the ranch hadn't, and the tulip bulbs pressed into cold ground hadn't, not quite on their own. It had made them a team, not husband and reluctant wife anymore, something closer to partners, forged fast and unplanned, the way iron gets tempered. Not gently, all at once under pressure neither of them had asked for. A few nights later, Holt asked her something nobody had thought to ask her in a very long while. What did you want, he said, before any of this, before Voss's letter, before the bank, if your father's land had never gone dry, and none of this had happened at all, what were you after, for yourself? Josie sat with the question a moment, turning it over like an unfamiliar coin. Nobody's asked me that, she admitted. Not even my father. Not in years. I'm asking now. She looked into the fire, remembering, and it took her a moment to find the shape of the answer, because she'd stopped letting herself want things along, while back, somewhere around the second bad harvest, when wanting had started to feel like a luxury her family couldn't afford. I wanted to teach, she said finally. There was a school 2 towns over from ours, before the drought took most of the families west looking for better ground. I used to think if things had gone different, I might have trained up for it. Taught children their letters. Had a little house of my own with a garden, and nobody's permission needed to plant what I liked in it. That's not so far from what you've got now, Holt said, careful, watching her face. It's not the same and we both know it. She said it without heat, just honest. This garden isn't mine because I earned it. It's mine because a debt got settled, with my name attached to the settling. He was quiet at that. Didn't argue it, which she respected more than if he had. Would you still want it? He asked. The school, if it were offered to you now. I don't know. She considered it, truly considered it, maybe for the first time since the wedding. I think I'd want to be asked, at least, even if the answer stayed the same. I'm asking. I know. She looked over at him, firelight moving warm across his face, and felt something in her chest loosen, that had been pulled tight, since the morning her father folded his good shirt with shaking hands. That's rather the whole of what's different here, isn't it? You keep asking. Nobody else thought to. He didn't answer that with words. Just held her gaze a long moment, steady, the way he held everything, and Josie understood, sitting there in the firelight, that she had married a man who intended to spend the rest of his days asking her questions other men wouldn't have thought worth the breath. It wasn't love yet. She wasn't fool enough to call it that so soon. But it was the ground love could be built on if either of them let it. And Josie found, turning the thought over, that she wasn't afraid of where that ground might lead. Not anymore. Not the way she'd been afraid of nearly everything, since the morning she'd first walked into that church. They rode into Larkspur Crossing the following Wednesday for supplies. One Main Street, a general store, a bank, a church, a saloon at the far end, where decent women didn't linger. The kind of town where everyone knew everyone's business, and most of what they knew wasn't true. Josie felt the stairs the second her boots hit the boardwalk. Women drew their skirts a half step aside. Men smirked behind their hands like boys sharing a dirty joke. She'd known it would be like this, had braced for it the whole ride in, running through it in her head, over and over, the way a person practices a line they hope they won't need. It didn't help. Bracing for a slap never made the sting of it any less. She was learning. Just meant you didn't fall down when it landed. Holt walked beside her, steady, silent, a wall between her and all of it. Inside the general store, the clerk's wife weighed out flour and wouldn't lift her eyes to meet Josie's. Outside, a man leaned drunk against the porch post, grinning wide and yellow-toothed. Well, he drawled, if it ain't the new Mrs. Sterling. How's married life treatin' you, sweetheart? Sterling break you in gentle? Josie froze. Holt moved. Not fast, not loud. Just there, suddenly, between her and the man, close enough that the drunk's grin faltered and slid clean off his face. You got something to say, Holt said, quiet as a held breath. You say it to me. Didn't mean nothin' by it? The man muttered, backing off a step. Then don't say nothing. They left without another word between them and the town. In the wagon, Josie sat stiff, staring at her own hands. I'm sorry, she finally said. Holt glanced at her, jaw still tight. For what? For this. The talk. The way they look at you now because of me. They can look all they want. He kept his eyes on the road ahead. Doesn't change what's true. And what's true? He was quiet a moment, the wagon wheels rolling steady beneath them. That you're here, he said. That you're safe. That's all that's true and all that matters. Josie looked at him then, really looked, the lines starting at the corners of his eyes. The set of his shoulders. The way he held those reins like he held everything. Steady, unshaken, careful not to pull too hard on anything that hadn't asked to be led. Thank you, she whispered. He only nodded. Didn't say more. Didn't need to. The next afternoon, Holt brought a rifle out to the yard and set 2 tin cans on the fence rail, and Josie looked at him like he'd suggested she take up dancing on the roof. I don't need to learn that. Ranch this size, this far from town, every soul on it ought to know how to handle a rifle. Man, woman, doesn't matter. He held it out to her, stock first, patient. Not saying you'll ever need it. Saying I'd sleep easier knowing you could if it came to that. She thought of the drunk cowboy on the boardwalk. Thought, unbidden, of Garrett Voss's easy smile and Randall Pruitt's low voice through a saloon window she hadn't yet overheard, but some instinct in her already seemed to be bracing for. She took the rifle. Show me. He came around behind her, close, adjusting her grip, her stance, his voice low, and even at her ear. Feet apart. Weight forward, not back on your heels. Bring it up slow, sight down the barrel, don't snatch at the trigger. Squeeze it like you're easing a door shut so it doesn't wake somebody sleeping. Her first shot went wide, kicked up just a good 3 feet from the nearest can. Her second went wider. You're anticipating the kick, Holt said. Flinching before it happens. Trust the rifle to do what it's built to do and just aim it. Her third shot clipped the fence post an inch from the can, and her fourth sent the whole thing spinning off into the grass, and she let out a startled whoop of a laugh that surprised them both. There it is, Holt said, something warm moving behind his eyes. I did that. You surely did. She fired at the second can, until it, too, went tumbling and stood there afterward, with the rifle warm in her hands, and a fierce, unfamiliar pride sitting in her chest, and thought that a month ago she had stood at an altar unable to imagine a single thing she might still choose for herself in this life. And now here she was, choosing to learn, choosing to be someone who could stand her own ground, if the ground ever demanded it of her. Again tomorrow, Holt said, taking the rifle back gentle, cleaning it as he spoke. And the day after. A skill like this isn't worth much, unless a person keeps it sharp. Yes, sir, she said, mock solemn, and he huffed out a laugh at that, and neither one of them could have said, watching the sun go down gold over the north pasture that evening, just how soon That particular skill might come to matter a great deal more than either of them yet understood. The sun went down red and gold behind the mountains that evening, and Holt found her out in the yard, on her knees in the cold dirt, pressing something small and brown into the earth. "What are those?" "Tulip bulbs," she said. "For spring." He crouched beside her, watched her cover them gently, pat the soil smooth. "You think you'll still be here, come spring?" She looked up, met his eyes straight on, for the first time without flinching. "Yes," she said. "I think I will." Something passed between them, small, unspoken, real enough to leave a mark. He stood, turned to go, then stopped. "Josephine." "Yes, I'm glad." He walked back toward the house, and she stayed there in the dark garden along, while with her hands still in the cold ground, her heart lighter than it had been in longer than she could remember. It was past midnight, a few nights after that, when Josie woke and couldn't fall back under, wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, padded downstairs in her stocking feet, meaning only to sit by the last of the fire a while. Holt was already there, on the porch alone, the cold not seeming to touch him at all, staring out at a sky gone thick with stars. Something small held between his hands. A photograph, creased at one corner, soft at the edges from handling. She hesitated in the doorway, nearly turned back, then didn't. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked, soft, stepping out into the cold. He glanced up, didn't hide the photograph away, the way she half expected he might. "Not tonight," he said. She sat beside him. Not close, near enough, though, that the porch boards creaked under them both. "May I?" He handed it over without a word. A young woman looked back at her from the paper. Dark hair pinned up soft around her face. Kind eyes, the kind that showed even in a photograph gone still and gray. A bundle in her arms, barely visible, swaddled tight. "Anna," Holt said. "My wife, and our son." Josie's breath caught somewhere behind her ribs. "She died in childbirth," he said, plain, no dressing wrapped around the words at all. 5 years back this January. The baby didn't make it either. Neither one of them made it through that night. Holt. It was all she had. His name and nothing to put after it. "I thought I'd buried it," he said. The grief. Thought a man could put a thing like that in the ground and it would stay there. He turned the photograph over in his hands, careful, like it might break. Some nights it comes back up anyway. Not warning. Just there, sudden, the way weather turns on the plains. Josie looked at the photograph a long while. At the woman who had loved him first. At the child, who had never once drawn breath in this world. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I am too." He took the photograph back, tucked it into his coat pocket, close to his chest, the way a man keeps something he can't afford to lose twice. "I married you because I was tired of being alone in that house," he said. "That's the truth of it, plain as I can give it to you. But I didn't marry you to fill her place, Josephine. Nobody could do that. Nobody's meant to try." "I know." They sat in silence a while. The stars turned slow overhead, ancient, indifferent to any of it. Somewhere out past the north pasture, a coyote called once and went quiet. "Do you still love her?" Josie asked, careful, not sure she had the right to ask it at all. "Every day." He looked over at her, steady. "But grief doesn't mean a man stops living, Josephine. Anna wouldn't want that from me. Neither would my son, if he'd had the chance to want anything at all." Josie felt tears come up sudden and sharp behind her eyes. Not for herself. For him. For the years he'd sat on this porch alone with a photograph and a silence nobody had thought to sit beside until tonight. "You're a good man, Holt Sterling." He huffed out something that wasn't quite a laugh. "Town might argue that point. The town doesn't know you. And you do?" She considered it honest before she answered. "I'm starting to." Something small moved across his face. A smile barely there. Sat around the edges but real all the way through. They stayed out on that porch until the cold finally drove them both back inside. And neither one of them said much more, because some things, once spoken, don't need to be added onto. They just need to be allowed to sit there, quiet, between two people learning how to carry each other's weight a little at a time. It was 2 nights later that Josie couldn't sleep. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and went down in the dark, quiet on the stairs, meaning only to warm milk by the stove. Instead, she found the kitchen empty and low voices carrying, through the open window, from the porch. Ezra's voice, careful, low, the way a man talks when he's picking his words off a shelf one at a time. You sure about all this, Holt? Man like Garrett Voss don't usually do favors out of the goodness of his heart. Josie went still in the dark kitchen, one hand flat against the wall. What are you saying? Holt said. I'm saying I rode to Wichita last week on the cattle business. Heard some things at the stockyard office. Feller I know does title work for the county. Says Voss bought up Elias Calloway's note from the bank back in July. Bought it outright before Pruitt's bank ever sent the first foreclosure letter. A silence stretched long enough that Josie's own pulse filled it. You're telling me, Holt said, that Voss owned that debt before he ever came to either of us with an offer? I'm telling you he engineered the whole thing, near as I can figure. Bought the paper quiet, waited on the drought to do the rest of the work for him, then walked in looking like a man doing 2 families a kindness. Why, Holt said, barely a word at all, more like a breath with an edge on it. That, Ezra said, I don't have an answer to yet, but a man doesn't spend that kind of money on kindness. Not out here, not ever. Josie stood in the dark kitchen, with her hand still pressed to the wall, and the milk forgotten on the stove behind her, and her whole understanding of the last 3 weeks tilting sideways like a wagon losing a wheel. Because it hadn't been the bank at all. Because it hadn't been drought, and bad luck, and nothing more. Because someone had wanted this marriage to happen. Had built the road that led her straight to that altar stone by stone, weeks before her father ever wept at the kitchen table. Which meant somebody had a reason, and she didn't yet know what it was. She went back up the stairs without the milk, without a sound, and sat a long time on the edge of her bed, with the lamp unlit, staring into the dark, turning the name Garrett Voss over and over like a stone she couldn't put down. He came to the ranch himself, 10 days later, on ranch business, he said, though Josie noted the way his eyes moved over the barns and the northern pastures like a man taking inventory of something he already half considered his own. Tall, well-dressed for a county, where most men wore their good coat twice a year, a voice smooth as poured syrup and just as sticky once it got on you. Mrs. Sterling, he said, tipping his hat to her on the porch steps, smiling with his mouth and nothing else. Married life agrees with you, I see. Mr. Voss. She kept her voice even. Gave nothing away. She'd had 10 days now to learn how. Holt came out from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag, watching Voss the way a man watches whether he doesn't trust. Garrett, he said, not warm. Holt, fine day. Thought I'd ride out, see how things settled. Since the wedding. Business is business, but a man likes to know his arrangements turned out well for everybody. They did, Holt said, flat. A door closing. Glad to hear it. Voss's eyes drifted, just for a second, toward the ridge line north of the house, toward the quarter section, where Sterling land ran up against the old boundary Elias Calloway had once held a claim to, before hard times took it, from him decades back before any of this began. Fine water up that way, isn't it? Always did admire this piece of ground. Holt didn't answer that, just watched him with eyes gone hard, and still as creek ice. Voss smiled wider, like the silence pleased him. Tipped his hat once more to Josie. Mrs. Sterling, pleasure as always. One more thing, Voss said, already turned half toward his horse, like the thought had only just occurred to him, casual as anything. Understand your father-in-law held an old claim once, up along that same north boundary, before hard times took it from him. Funny how these things circle back around, isn't it? Land finding its way home. Josie felt the porch boards go unsteady beneath her, though she hadn't moved an inch. I wasn't aware there was a claim, Holt said. careful, even, giving away nothing, though Josie could see, now that she was learning to read him, the small tightening at the corner of his jaw, that meant he was giving away exactly, as much as he chose to, and not a hair more. Oh, county records are a fascinating study, if a man's got the patience for them. Voss smiled, wide and easy. I find I do. Good day, Garrett. Mrs. Sterling. One more tip of his hat, and he swung up into the saddle unhurried, a man with all the time in the world, and every reason to spend it exactly this way. He rode off down the lane unhurried, a man in no rush at all, and Josie stood on the porch watching his dust settle long, after he'd gone, a cold certainty forming low in her chest that had nothing to do with the October wind. That night, once Josie had gone up, Holt found Ezra out by the barn, mending a bridle by lantern light. You hear what he said about the claim? Heard it. Ezra didn't look up from his work. Same as I told you 2 weeks back. Only now he's saying it to your face instead of behind it. Man's not even bothering to hide it anymore. Why show his hand at all, then? If he's got a plan, why walk up my porch steps and hand me half of it? Ezra set the bridle down, looked at Holt steady, the way he used to look at him across a dying campfire on the trail, back when they were both young enough to think trouble was something you could outride. Because he doesn't figure you can stop him, Ezra said. Man like Voss, he's not afraid of you knowing. He's counting on you not being able to do a blessed thing about it once you do. Holt was quiet a long moment, looking off toward the dark ridge to the north, where good water ran under good grass, and had, apparently for 30 years, been sitting on a claim nobody living had thought worth remembering. He's wrong, Holt said finally. Hope so, boss. Ezra picked the bridle back up. For her sake as much as yours. Because a man like that didn't ride 2 hours out, from town just to ask, after her happiness. Because he'd looked at that northern ridge the way her father used to look at land he meant to buy. And because 3 days later, riding into town again for supplies, Josie stepped past the open door of the Larkspur Saloon on her way to the Mercantile, and heard 2 voices inside, low, unhurried, one of them belonging to Garrett Voss, and the other unmistakably to Randall Pruitt, the very banker who was supposed to have held her father's note all along. The northern quarters, the whole of it, Pruitt was saying. Water rights carry the value. Sterling won't sell it outright, not for love or money. But if it comes to the girl, through the marriage, through her father's old claim, it will, Voss said, easy, certain, like a man discussing the weather. Give it time. These things settle themselves, Randall. They always do. Josie stood frozen on the boardwalk outside, one hand pressed flat against the rough wood siding of the saloon wall, her heart going hard and fast against her ribs, because it hadn't been kindness at all, because it had never been about her, or her father's shame, or even Holt's lonely house needing a woman's hand in it. It was the land. It had always, from the very first letter, been about the land, about water rights buried 30 years deep in an old claim nobody, but a banker and a schemer had bothered to remember still existed. Her father's claim, filed decades back, forgotten, worthless on paper, until a marriage carried it, quiet as a Trojan horse, straight onto sterling ground. Which meant her father hadn't just lost a debt. Which meant Garrett Voss hadn't found a kindness to offer at all. He'd found a key, and she was the key. She'd been the key, from the very first day, and she hadn't even known the lock she was meant to open. Her hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against her skirt to still them, and couldn't quite manage it. Should she tell Holt? Right there, right now, standing on the boardwalk, with her pulse hammering loud enough she could hear it in her own ears. Except what if he already knew? What if this whole tender, careful courtship, the locked door, the bread left warm, the photograph handed, over on a cold porch, had only ever been the second half of the same plan? No, she stopped that thought before it could finish forming, because that wasn't the man who'd stood between her and a drunk on this very street 2 weeks back. That wasn't the man who'd said, "You're my wife, that doesn't mean I own you," and meant every word of it. She had to believe that, because if she didn't, there was nothing solid left to stand on at all. She turned from the saloon window and walked fast down the boardwalk toward the wagon, toward Holt, her mind already racing ahead of her own feet, already understanding that whatever quiet peace had begun growing between them these last weeks. Out in that garden, over that kitchen table, on that cold porch with a photograph passed hand to hand, was about to be tested by something a great deal larger and a great deal colder than town gossip. Because gossip a person could outlast. A person could hold her chin up and walk through a room full of whispers and come out the other side of it standing. This was something else. This had a plan behind it, money behind it, a banker and a stranger with soft hands and a soft voice, sitting in a saloon 2 streets over, dividing up land that didn't belong to either one of them, like men carving a Sunday roast. And plans like that, Josie understood, climbing up into the wagon beside a husband, who still didn't know what she'd just heard, didn't stop simply because 2 strangers had started, against every reasonable expectation, to care for one another. If anything, she thought, watching Holt click the horses forward, his profile calm against the wide autumn sky, that was exactly the kind of thing a plan like Garrett Voss's was built to survive. She would have to tell him, tonight, before supper went cold on the table between them the way so many things already had. But not yet. Not on this street, with Voss's voice still crawling under her skin, and Larkspur Crossing watching, from every window like it always did. Tonight, at home, where the lock was on her side of the door, and where, for the first time, since she'd walked into that church a stranger's bride, she finally had somebody worth trusting with the truth. Supper sat half-eaten between them. Josie had pushed the food around her plate twice, over, and hadn't managed more than a few bites, and Holt had noticed. He noticed most things about her now. She was coming to understand. It was one of the quiet gifts of a man who'd spent years reading weather and worried cattle for a living. "You've been somewhere else all evening," he said. "Since town." She set her fork down. "I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear all of it before you say anything back." Something shifted in his face. Not alarm exactly. Attention sharpening the way it did when a storm cloud changed color on the horizon. "All right," so she told him. The saloon window. Randall Pruitt's voice, unhurried, certain. The words, the northern quarters, the whole of it, and water rights carry the value, and if it comes to the girl, through her father's old claim. Voss's easy answer. "It will. These things settle themselves." Holt didn't move the whole time she spoke. Didn't touch his coffee. Just sat there, still as stone, while she laid the whole ugly shape of it out on the table between them, next to the cold supper neither of them wanted anymore. When she finished, the silence went on long enough that she started to be afraid of it. "Holt, I'm here." His voice came out low, rough at the edges. "Just trying to understand how long I've been standing in the middle of another man's plan, without knowing it. You didn't know. Neither did you, until today." He looked up at her then, and there was something in his face she hadn't seen before. Not the stillness she'd first mistaken for coldness at the altar, and not the careful warmth that had grown up slow between them since. Something harder. Something that looked, for the first time, like a man deciding exactly how far he was willing to go to protect what belonged to him. "They think they've already won," he said. "Because they think I'll never find the paper trail. Because they think you're just a girl who signed where her father told her to sign, and I'm just a rancher too proud to ask questions. Are we wrong to be afraid of them? No." He reached across the table, didn't take her hand, not quite. Just laid his own beside it, close enough that she could feel the warmth of it, and let her decide the rest. "But being afraid and being beaten aren't the same thing, Josephine. Not by a long stretch." She looked down at his hand. Then, slow, she covered it with her own. "What do we do?" "First thing," he said, "we find out exactly what claim your father held, and whether Voss has already moved on it. Ezra's got a man in the county recorder's office who owes him a favor. Second thing," he stopped, studied her face like he was memorizing it against whatever was coming. "Second thing, we stop pretending this is your trouble or mine. It's ours now, both of us, or it doesn't work at all." Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the shutters, carrying the first hard cold of the season down off the high plains. Somewhere out past the north pasture, past the ridge Garrett Voss had looked at, with a buyer's eyes, the land sat quiet under the dark, worth more than either of them had understood 2 months back, when a stranger's letter had first come to a desperate man's kitchen table and set all of this in motion. Josie sat with her hand under Holt's, in a house that had started slowly, without either of them quite noticing the exact moment it happened, to feel less like a stranger's roof over her head and more like something worth defending. Whatever came next, she thought, she wasn't facing it alone anymore. And for the first time, since that borrowed dress, and that yellowed lace, and those 14 floorboards between herself, and a door she'd been too frightened to walk through, that thought didn't feel like fear at all. It felt like the beginning of something she hadn't let herself hope for. Felt like ground worth standing on. Morning came in slow and gray over the Sterling place, and neither Josie nor Holt had slept more than an hour or two, and it showed. It showed in the dark under both their eyes. It showed in the way Holt stood at the kitchen window while before he ever poured his coffee, staring north, toward that ridge like he could see straight, through the hillside to whatever paper trail was buried under it. "Ezra rides for Wichita today," he said finally. "His man at the county recorder's office. If there's a claim on record, we'll know the shape of it by week's end. And if there isn't, then we've got nothing but a banker's whispered conversation and a schemer's smile to go on, which isn't nothing, Josephine, but it isn't proof either." He turned from the window, looked at her steady the way he did when he meant a thing all the way through. "We'll find proof." "You sound certain." "I am certain." A pause. "About that, anyway." She almost smiled. Almost. There wasn't quite enough left in her that morning to finish the job, because that was the trouble with fear she was learning. It didn't arrive all at once and then leave you be. It moved in, unpacked its bags, sat down at the breakfast table across from you every single morning until you nearly forgot what the house had felt like before it came. Ezra rode out before sunup with a list of names and dates folded careful into his coat pocket, and he was gone the better part of a week. The days without him stretched long. Holt worked harder than Josie had, yet seen him work up before light, in past dark, like a man trying to outrun a thought by staying too tired to think it. She understood the impulse, tried a version of it herself, scrubbed the kitchen floor twice in 3 days, mended shirts that hardly needed mending, baked bread nobody had asked for, and more of it than 2 people and a bunkhouse full of hands could rightly eat. Because if her hands stayed busy, her mind couldn't circle the same worn track it kept wanting to circle, which was, what if Ezra found nothing? Which was, what if he found something worse than nothing? Which was, what if the whole quiet, careful thing growing between herself and Holt Sterling was never going to be given the chance to become what it was reaching toward, because a banker and a schemer had already decided how the story ended weeks before either of them had ever sat down at that kitchen table. She caught herself twice, standing at the window, with a dish towel still in her hands, staring north same as Holt had. "Stop it," she told herself. "Just stop." She didn't stop. On the 3rd day of waiting, Holt found her scrubbing the same section of floor a second time, and took the brush gently out of her hand. "That floor's cleaner than the day I bought this house." It needed doing. It needed doing Tuesday. It's Thursday, Josephine, and you've worn a groove in the boards. Well, somebody's got to keep busy while we wait to find out if we've got a home left to defend. "Come mend fence with me instead," he said. "At least fence mending's honest work. Doesn't just move dirt from one corner of a clean floor to another." She glared at him. He didn't so much as blink. "Fine," she said. "But if I hammer my thumb, I'm blaming you entirely. Wouldn't dream of taking the credit for anyone else's aim." They worked the fence line through the cold afternoon, Holt driving posts, while Josie held the wire taut, and it was, despite everything hanging over both their heads, almost peaceful. The kind of ordinary, unhurried labor that let a mind rest while from circling its own worst fears. "You're better at this than you were a month ago," Holt observed. watching her wrap the wire clean around a post, without needing to be shown twice. I had a good teacher. Modest teacher too. I said good, didn't say modest. She tied off the wire, sat back on her heels, studying her own work, with real satisfaction. Ezra tells me you were the worst-tempered trail boss on the whole Chisholm route, your first 2 seasons running an outfit. Ezra tells you a great many things he ought to keep to himself. He tells me you once made a hand walk the last 4 miles into Dodge City because the fool tried arguing with you about which way a storm was moving. That fool, Holt said, driving the next post with rather more force than strictly necessary, was wrong about the storm. I'm sure he was. Doesn't mean walking him wasn't excessive. He walked it in under an hour. Built character. Is that what you'll do to me, the day I finally argue with you about something important? He looked over at her then, something warm and amused moving behind the tiredness in his eyes. Josephine, you argue with me about something important nearly every single day. I've yet to make you walk anywhere for it. There's still time. There is, he agreed, straight-faced. Though I confess the odds are against me managing it. You've got a stubborn streak wider than the whole Chisholm Trail, and I say that as a compliment. Whatever your face is doing right now, that suggests you don't believe me. She laughed. A real laugh, surprised out of her, the first one in days, that didn't have worry tangled up somewhere underneath it, and for a moment working that fence line under a cold gray sky, with a threat still hanging 4 days off, Josie let herself simply be happy. Let herself believe, if only for the length of an afternoon, that whatever came on Sunday, she'd at least gotten this much first. This ordinary, unhurried, foolish, wonderful ordinary life, mending fence beside a man she'd once been too frightened to look at straight on. It didn't last, that peace. Couldn't, not with everything still circling overhead like a hawk, that hadn't yet decided when to strike. But it was enough, that one afternoon, to remind her exactly what she was fighting for, underneath all the fear, and the forged signatures, and the smoke still faintly clinging to a rebuilt barn wall. Not just land. Not just a claim 30 years buried in dusty county paper. This, simply this. A fence mended together, a laugh shared under a gray sky, a man who'd become, somewhere along the road, from stranger to husband, the truest home she'd ever known. Ezra came back on a Thursday evening, dust to his eyebrows, his horse blown hard from the last stretch, and Holt met him in the yard before he'd even swung down from the saddle. Well, come inside. Ezra's face gave nothing away, which frightened Josie more than, if it had. This isn't a yard conversation. They sat at the kitchen table, the lamp turned up bright, and Ezra laid out a small stack of papers, copied by hand in a clerk's careful script, and cleared his throat like a man about to read scripture he didn't entirely trust the meaning of himself. Elias Calloway filed a water claim on the northern quarter section back in 1861, Ezra said, before the war, before this land was ever sterling land at all. He proved up on it 3 years running, then hard times took the whole homestead out from under him and the claim just sat, never formally dissolved. Never formally transferred either when the land changed hands twice over the following 20 years. County clerk figures it slipped through a crack nobody's bothered patching since. Meaning what? Holt said. Low. Meaning that water right might still be good, legally speaking. Meaning whoever holds Elias Calloway's name by blood or by marriage might have a claim on it a court would actually have to hear. Ezra tapped the top paper. Meaning Garrett Voss didn't need to buy your northern pasture at all, Holt. He just needed a Calloway sitting inside a sterling household when somebody finally got around to filing the right paperwork. The room went very still. Josie felt something cold move down the back of her neck. He needed a marriage, she said. Quiet. Not a purchase. A marriage. Because a purchase you'd have said no to. But a marriage. A marriage looks like kindness, Holt finished. Right up until the day it doesn't. Ezra nodded, grim. There's more. My man says a fellow matching Voss's description came through the recorder's office back in the spring. Asked to see the old plat maps for this township. paid the clerk a little something extra to copy the Calloway claim out by hand. He looked up. This wasn't chance, either of you. This was planned, before your father's crops ever failed a second season running, Mrs. Sterling. Planned before the bank ever sent its first notice. Josie sat with, that a long moment, the lamp hissing soft between them, and thought of her father's hands shaking around, that coffee cup, 3 weeks before the wedding. Thought of him saying I said no, first thing out of my mouth I said no, and thought with a fresh, sick understanding that her father hadn't stumbled into ruin at all. He'd been herded into it. Slow, patient, the way a good stockman herds cattle he doesn't want spooked, into running the wrong direction. I need to talk to him, she said. My father, he doesn't know any of this. He thinks it was just drought, just bad luck. I'll drive you myself, Holt said. Tomorrow. They didn't have to wait for tomorrow. Elias Calloway arrived at the Sterling place the very next morning, unannounced, his wagon horse lathered, from a hard drive, and one look at his face told Josie something had already gone wrong somewhere out past the edges of what she understood. Papa! She was down the porch steps, before he'd fully reined in. What's happened? I need to speak with you. His eyes went past her to Holt, standing in the doorway. Both of you. He'll allow it. He'll allow it, Holt said, already crossing the yard. They sat in the front room, the fire built up against a morning gone sharp and cold, and Elias Calloway held his hat in his lap and turned it round and round between his hands, the exact way he had the morning of the wedding, and Josie understood, watching him, that whatever he'd come to say had been sitting in him a long while, festering, before he'd finally found the nerve to drive it out here and set it down. I lied to you, he said, to Josie, not looking at her. Not about the drought. The drought was real enough. But I let you believe it was only the drought. Only bad luck, 2 years running, the way the Lord sometimes tests a man for no reason a person can name. Papa, let me finish, before I lose the nerve for it. He took a breath that shook on the way in. 2 years back, a broker started buying up the co-op's grain contracts, offering better prices than the mill would at first. Half the farmers in the county signed on, with him, myself included, glad of the extra income. Then, the very next season, that same broker started underselling every one of us, who hadn't signed with him. Flooding the market, driving the price of wheat down so low a man couldn't cover his own seed cost, let alone his note at the bank. Voss, Holt said, flat. I didn't know his name at the time, just knew a man kept showing up at auction, kept offering, kept undercutting, and I couldn't work out how he was managing to lose money on every sale and keep coming back for more. Elias's hands had gone still on the hat now, gripping it hard enough to bend the brim. It wasn't until he came to me himself, this past summer, with the offer to settle my note. It wasn't until I saw his face in my own kitchen that I understood, because I recognized him from the auction house. I just hadn't put the two things together yet. Hadn't wanted to, maybe. Josie sat frozen, the fire crackling loud in the sudden silence, turning it all over. 2 years. He'd spent 2 years grinding her father down to nothing, on purpose, patient as a man laying a trap he intended to walk away from clean. Why? She whispered. Why go to such lengths? Over a water claim 30 years old, that hardly anybody remembered. Because water's worth more than gold out here, Holt said quiet. If a man's got a mind to sell it to a railroad looking to lay track through dry country, and because a claim that old, forgotten that long, is exactly the kind of thing a patient man can walk in and take for next to nothing, if he sets the table right first. Elias looked up then, and Josie saw, for the first time, since the wedding, something in her father's face that wasn't shame. It was rage. Old, banked-down rage, the kind a proud man carries along, while before he lets himself feel the whole weight of it. I signed away my daughter's future, he said, to a man who spent 2 years engineering my ruin on purpose. I need you both to understand. I would never have agreed, not for any price, if I'd known the ruin wasn't chance, if I'd known it was built. We know that now, Josie said, reached over, took his hand, the way she hadn't been able to make herself do since the morning of the wedding. That's why you're here, isn't it? To help us stop him. That, her father said. And because I couldn't carry the lie one more day and still call myself your father. Holt walked Elias out to his wagon afterward, the two men alone in the cold yard, while Josie stayed by the fire, and something passed between them that neither had quite managed in all their months of careful, distant politeness. I owe you an apology too, Elias said, gathering his reins. I handed you a wife under false pretenses, same as I handed Voss my signature under them. You'd every right to send me off your land the day I told you the whole of it. I considered it, Holt admitted, for about as long as it took you to say her name. Elias looked at him, surprised. She's my wife, Elias. Whatever the terms of how that came to be, I don't hold a father's desperation against a daughter he loves enough to weep over. I hold it against the man who engineered the desperation in the first place. Holt's jaw set, the same hard line Josie had come to recognize, as resolve rather than anger. You're not my enemy in this. You never were. You're just another man Garrett Voss decided was worth ruining on his way to something he wanted. That's more grace than I've shown myself these past months. Then borrow some of mine a while, Holt said. Until you've built your own back up. I've got a fair amount to spare these days. More than I did before your daughter walked into my kitchen and started leaving the door unlocked. Something loosened in Elias Calloway's face at that, the first real ease Holt had seen in the man, since the wedding, months of shame finally finding a little room to breathe. You're a better man than this county gives you credit for, Holt Sterling. The county's opinion of me matters a good deal less than it used to, Holt said. Now that I've got someone in that house whose opinion I actually care about keeping. He held out his hand. We'll see this through together, Elias. All the way, whatever it costs. Elias shook it, firm, and climbed up into his wagon, and Holt stood watching him go, until the dark swallowed the sound of the wheels entirely, thinking that whatever else Garrett Voss's scheme had cost this family, it had also, strangely, given him something he hadn't expected to gain, from a marriage he'd never asked for. A father-in-law worth calling family, a wife worth calling love, and an enemy worth, finally, standing up against in the open, rather than absorbing quiet, the way he'd absorbed Anna's loss 5 years before, alone, with nobody beside him to share the weight of it. He wasn't alone this time. That, more than anything, was the thing he meant to hold on to whatever Sunday brought. The fire came 3 nights later. Josie woke to the smell of smoke first, before she heard anything at all, and for one long, disoriented second she thought she was dreaming it. Some leftover fear, from the day Elias had sat by their hearth, and unspooled 2 years of quiet ruin. Then she heard Holt's voice, sharp and close, already halfway into his boots. Stay in the house. Holt! Stay in the house, Josephine. I mean it. He was gone before she could argue it, out into a yard gone orange at the edges, and Josie stood at the window watching flame climb up the side of the hay barn. Fast, hungry, the kind of fire that didn't care what it was told. She didn't stay in the house. She grabbed the rifle from beside the door, because a person didn't argue with a fire, but a person could still be useful near one, hauling water, running rope, doing whatever an extra pair of hands was good for, and ran. The next half hour blurred into heat and smoke and shouted orders, buckets passed hand to hand down a line that stretched from the well to the barn door, Ezra directing men half-dressed and wild-eyed, Holt at the center of it, soot-streaked, driving the fight like he'd driven cattle through worse. They saved the barn, lost the season's hay, most of it, and lost it in a way that told its own story because a fire that started at 3 separate points along the same wall wasn't an accident any coroner in the county would rule as such. Lamp oil, Ezra said afterward, crouched at the char line, holding up a scorched rag that smelled of more than smoke. Somebody set this deliberate. Holt's face, in the gray light, before dawn, had gone somewhere Josie hadn't seen it go before. Not rage exactly. Something colder than rage. Something with its teeth already set. No proof it was him, Ezra said low, like he was talking Holt down off a ledge. Don't need proof to know, Holt said. Just need it to do something about knowing. Josie stood a little apart from them both, rifle still in her hands, watching smoke curl up gray against a sky just beginning to lighten, and felt something she hadn't let herself feel yet. Not fully, not until this exact moment. Terror. Not for herself. For him. For this house, this land, this man who'd married a stranger out of loneliness, and ended up, somehow, in the crosshairs of a fight that had never once been his to begin with. Because that was the shape of it now, plain as the smoke still rising. Voss wasn't just after land anymore, if he ever had been only that. He was sending a message. And the message was, I can reach you, anytime I choose, however close I choose. Holt found her still standing in the yard once the last of the bucket line had broken up, and the men had gone to catch what little sleep remained before dawn. Her hands were raw from rope and cold water both. She hadn't noticed until he took one in his own, careful, turning it over toward the graying light. You should have stayed in the house. I couldn't. Josephine. I couldn't, Holt. Her voice cracked, finally, all the strength that had carried her, through the bucket line, and the smoke, and the shouted orders draining out of her at once now, that there was nothing left to fight. I stood at that window and watched flame climbing your barn, and all I could think was that it was my fault, my father's claim, my name. If I'd never come here. Stop, he said it firm, both hands coming up to hold her face, forcing her to look at him instead of at the smoldering wreckage behind them. If you'd never come here, Voss would have found some other lever to pull, some other family to ruin quiet, the way he ruined your father, until he found whatever door he needed open. You didn't build this scheme, Josephine. You're not the fire. You're the reason I'm standing here fighting it instead of sitting alone in a dark house, same as I did for 5 years before you walked into it. She let out a breath that was half sob, half something closer to relief, and leaned into him, exhausted, smoke-streaked, shaking with cold and fear both. I'm frightened, she admitted, small, into his shoulder. Truly frightened, Holt. Not the kind that passes with a good night's sleep. I know. He held her, steady, the way he held everything he meant to protect. I am too. Any man who tells you he isn't, watching his barn burn, and knowing worse might follow, is either a liar or a fool. But frightened isn't the same as beaten, Josephine. We agreed on that once already. I mean to keep agreeing on it, however many fires it takes to test the promise. They stood together along, while in the cold, ash-smelling dark, and Josie thought, even through the fear, that there was something almost unbearably tender in being held like this. Not despite the danger, but squarely inside it, by a man who hadn't once suggested she ought to be anywhere other than exactly where she stood. It wasn't enough to undo the terror sitting cold in her chest, but it was enough, barely, to carry her through what remained of that night. It wasn't enough, either, to stop the darker thought that crept in any way hours later, alone in her room, with dawn just breaking gray over the ruined edge of the barn. The thought that perhaps the kindest thing she could do for this man, who held her so carefully, was to remove herself from Garrett Voss's reach entirely, whatever it cost her own heart to do it. She didn't sleep the rest of that night, and by the time the sun came up proper, gray and thin, over a barnyard still smelling of char, Josie had already made up her mind about something she hated herself for deciding, even as she packed the small bag and set it by her bedroom door, because she couldn't do it. Couldn't sit at that kitchen table one more morning knowing her own name, her own blood, was the very thing that had put a torch to Holt Sterling's barn. Couldn't watch Ezra's grim face, or Holt's bank-down fury, and tell herself none of it traced straight back to her. She sat at the little writing desk in her room, and pulled out a fresh sheet of paper, and her hand shook, so bad the first line came out crooked. Dear Holt, she crossed it out, started again. I am leaving, not because of anything you've done, because of what my presence here has already cost you, and what it will go on costing you so long as I stay. Garrett Voss wants what came into this house through my father's name. If I am gone, there is nothing left for him to reach through. No wife, no claim worth chasing. Only a rancher and his land, same as before I ever came. She stopped. Read that back. Felt something in her chest crack clean down the middle. I did not choose to come here. I have come, these last weeks, to choose to stay. That is the cruelest part of any of this. That I found something worth staying for, right about the same hour it became too dangerous to keep. Thank you for the lock you never used against me. Thank you for the bread left warm outside my door. Thank you for asking me what I wanted, when nobody else had thought to in years. I will not forget any of it. Josephine. She folded the letter, set it on the nightstand, propped where it couldn't be missed, picked up the bag, and stood there in the gray early light, staring at her own open bedroom door. The very door that had once had a lock on it, a lock she'd turned, that first terrified night, and left turned for the better part of a week, before she'd started slow, without ever quite marking the day, to leave it open instead. What was she doing? Because leaving felt like the only decent thing left to do. Except it also felt like exactly the kind of running her father had done, 3 weeks before the wedding, when he'd said, "I can't watch what I've done to you," and driven away rather than stand in the wreckage of his own choice. And she had judged him for that. Softly, quietly, but she had judged him. Was this any different? She didn't have an answer. Just picked up the bag and went down the stairs as quiet as she could manage and made it as far as the kitchen, before Dawn caught her standing still in the middle of the floor, unable to make her feet carry her one step farther toward the door. Holt found her there 20 minutes later, coming in from the barn, soot still under his nails, and stopped dead in the doorway at the sight of the bag by her feet. He didn't say anything at first, just looked at the bag, then at her, then crossed to the nightstand, because he'd have seen the letter propped there. When he came up, she realized if she'd made it out the door in time, except she hadn't made it out the door, and so he found her instead, standing in the kitchen, with the letter still folded in her own coat pocket, never delivered at all. "Going somewhere," he said, quiet, careful, the way a man speaks to a spooked animal he doesn't want to startle further. "I was going to leave you a letter." "Where's the letter?" She pulled it from her pocket, held it out, watched his face while he read it, and made herself keep watching, though every part of her wanted to look away. He read it twice. She could tell by the way his eyes moved back up to the top a second time, before he finally lowered the page. "You're free to go," he said at last. "Low, even. Always were, Josephine. I meant that the first week you were here, and I mean it now. Then why do I feel like I'm being torn in half deciding it?" "Because you don't actually want to go." He set the letter down on the table between them. "You want the fire to have never happened. You want Voss to have never existed. You're trying to solve a problem you can't solve by removing yourself from a house he already knows exactly where to find." The words landed harder than she expected. Because he was right. Because leaving didn't undo the barn, or the fire, or 2 years of quiet ruin visited on her father's crops. It just meant she wouldn't be there to see whatever came next. "If I stay," she said, voice cracking despite every effort not to let it, "he could come again. Worse next time. He could." Holt didn't soften it, didn't pretty it up for her. "He could do that whether you're standing in this kitchen or 3 counties away, Josephine. A man like Voss doesn't stop because the pieces on his board rearrange themselves. He adjusts. That's what makes him dangerous." "Then what am I supposed to do?" He crossed the kitchen, stopped a few feet from her, close but not crowding, the same careful distance he'd kept since the very first night, the lock on her door, the bread left warm, and never once knocked for. "Choose," he said. "Not run. Not hide behind a letter on a nightstand. Choose out loud to me whether you're staying to face this alongside me, or whether you truly want out of it altogether, and if that's the case, I'll drive you to your father's myself and never say another word against it." Josie looked at him, at this man who had never once, in all their married life together, tried to make a decision for her that was rightly hers to make. "I choose to stay," she said. "Not because I'm not afraid. I'm terrified, if you want the truth of it plain. But I'd rather be terrified standing beside you than safe, and useless 3 counties off, wondering every single day what happened to you, because I wasn't here to help stop it. Something in Holt's face came loose at that. Not relief exactly. Something steadier than relief. Something that looked, for the first time since the fire, like a man remembering he wasn't fighting this alone. "All right then," he said. "All right. All right." He reached out, took her hand, careful the way he took everything. Then we stop reacting to what he does to us, and we start making him react to us instead. How? Ezra's contact in Wichita. The clerk who copied out those old plat maps for Voss back in the spring. Holt's jaw set, thinking it through even, as he spoke it aloud. A man who'll take money to copy documents quiet for one fellow might take money to talk plain for another. We find out exactly what Voss paid for and what he asked to see, and we build something solid enough to put in front of a judge instead of a barn full of ash and a banker's whispered conversation nobody but you overheard. And if that's not enough, then we find what is. He held her gaze, steady, unwavering, a man who had once driven cattle, through storms bad enough to kill lesser men, and had never once, by all accounts, turned a herd loose rather than see it through. "I didn't marry you to watch you run, Josephine, and I surely didn't build this life to hand it over to a man who burns barns in the dark because he hasn't got the nerve to knock on a front door in daylight." They spent the better part of the next week building a case out of scraps. Ezra rode back to Wichita, this time with cash enough to loosen a clerk's tongue rather than just his pen, and came home with a name. The surveyor Voss had hired to walk the old boundary lines, quiet, back in early summer, months before he'd ever ridden out to the Sterling place, with his easy smile and his talk of business arrangements. Holt wrote letters. Josie, at her father's insistence, sat down and wrote out, in careful, exact detail, every price Elias Calloway had been offered, and undercut on, over 2 years of grain sales, dates and figures both. The kind of record a man in the grip of ruin rarely thinks to keep, and she, thankfully, remembered near enough whole from listening at that same kitchen table months before any of this began. It was slow work, unglamorous work, the kind that didn't feel, most days, like it was building toward anything at all. But some evenings, sitting at the kitchen table with the lamp burned low and papers spread between them, Holt's hand would find hers across the table, without either of them quite deciding to let it happen, and Josie would think, watching him work. Steady, patient, unbroken by a burned barn or a banker's schemes or a wife he hadn't asked for, that whatever else Garrett Voss had planned for them, he hadn't planned on this. Hadn't planned on two people, thrown together by desperation and debt, deciding somewhere along the way to become something a fire, and a fraud, and a whole town's worth of whispers couldn't easily pull apart. The quilting circle invitation came the following Tuesday, hand-delivered by a boy on a borrowed pony, and Josie recognized Mrs. Pruitt's careful, looping hand on the envelope before she'd even broken the seal. "Dear Mrs. Sterling, the ladies of Larkspur Crossing would be honored by your presence at our Thursday quilting circle. Tea and fellowship at 2 o'clock. You don't have to go," Holt said, reading it over her shoulder. "I know. After the social. After everything Mrs. Pruitt already. I know, Holt." She folded the invitation, careful, her hands steadier than she expected them to be. "But if I keep hiding out here every time that woman sends an envelope, she wins something she hasn't earned. I'd rather she say whatever she means to say to my face than have it whispered behind my back for months more." He studied her a long moment, something between worry and admiration moving behind his eyes. "All right," he said finally. "But if it goes the way I think it might, you come straight home after. No walking. I'll have Ezra waiting with the wagon down the street out of sight, so it doesn't look like I sent a guard after my own wife. You worry too much." "I worry exactly the right amount," he said. For a man whose wife just told him she plans to sit in a room full of women who've already decided how this story ends. She didn't have an answer for that, because he wasn't wrong, because some part of her already knew, walking into that quilting circle 2 days later, that Thursday afternoon was going to cost her something, before it was through. She just didn't yet know how much. The church parlor smelled of lemon oil and false warmth. Gingham cloth over the long tables, same as the social weeks before, but no lemonade this time, no Reverend Whitfield moving warm and easy between the clusters of women, with a plate of cake in hand. Just tea and quilting frames set up in neat rows, and a dozen women, who looked up when Josie came through the door, with smiles sharp enough to draw blood. The room went quiet for exactly as long as it took Mrs. Pruitt to set down her needle. "Mrs. Sterling, how lovely you could join us. Thank you for the invitation." She took the chair they left open for her. The one at the end, she noticed, the one that put her back nearly to the wall, and wondered, sitting down into it, whether that had been chosen on purpose. She decided it didn't matter either way. She'd come. She'd sit. She'd sew a straight seam, if it killed her, and give this room nothing to talk about that wasn't already tired gossip 3 weeks stale. For a while it was almost bearable. Talk of recipes. Talk of the coming winter, and whose root cellar was stocked, and whose wasn't. Talk of a daughter, over in the next county courting a man nobody quite approved of. Josie kept her head down, over the quilt square in her lap, and her stitches small and even, and let herself believe, for the better part of an hour, that this might simply pass. Then Mrs. Pruitt set her own needle down again, slow, deliberate, and leaned forward, with a smile gone thin as a blade. "So, Josephine, dear." The room's chatter died at the sound of it, the way conversation dies, when everyone in it senses a storm coming, and decides, silently, unanimously, to watch it happen rather than stop it. "Do tell us. How does it feel to be bought?" The needle stopped in Josie's hand. "I beg your pardon." "Well." Mrs. Pruitt's smile widened, ugly under all that careful pleasantness. "Everyone knows your father sold you to settle his debts. We're only curious. What's the going rate for a young woman these days?" A ripple of laughter went round the table, thin, brittle, the kind of laughter that knows exactly how cruel it's being, and enjoys the knowing. "At least Sterling paid well," said a younger woman near the window, meaner than the rest, delighted with her own wit. "Your father got a fine price for you, didn't he?" Josie's hands had gone white around the fabric in her lap, because she could feel every eye in that room fixed on her, because she could feel the old fear rising up her throat, the same fear that had frozen her at the back of a church aisle months before, when she'd been too afraid to walk through a door of her own choosing. Except this time was different, because this time she wasn't standing at an altar with nowhere to run. This time she had a home to go back to, and a husband who'd told her, plain as anything, that she wasn't a bargain. This time she'd learned to ride a storm, and fire a rifle, and hold her seat on a green-broke mare, while lightning split the sky. She set the quilt square down, careful, deliberate, and she stood. The chair scraped loud against the floorboards in the sudden, ringing silence. "My father was desperate," she said, voice steady, steadier than she had any right to expect, given how hard her heart was slamming against her ribs. "Your husbands would have let his family starve rather than lift a finger to help. Holt Sterling gave me a choice you never gave me the credit of imagining I might have. That's more decency than any woman in this room has shown me since I arrived in this town." Mrs. Pruitt's smile finally cracked. "We're only concerned." "No." Josie cut her off, clean, before the sentence could finish. "You're not concerned. Concern doesn't come dressed up in cruelty and call itself tea and fellowship. What you are, Mrs. Pruitt, is unkind. There's a considerable difference, and I'd have thought a room full of church-going women might know it." Nobody spoke, because nobody, apparently, had expected the bought girl to speak back at all. Josie didn't wait to see what came. After the silence, she turned, walked to the door, spine straight, chin level, and didn't look back once at the row of stricken faces behind her, and stepped out into a cold gray afternoon that felt, after that room, almost like mercy. She'd told Holt she'd take the wagon. She didn't take the wagon, because taking the wagon meant finding Ezra, waiting 3 streets, over exactly where Holt had arranged him, and climbing up beside him, and letting the whole town watch her ride off looking rescued. Looking like a woman who needed rescuing. She didn't need rescuing. She needed to walk. Needed the cold air on her face, and the long, empty road under her boots, and 2 solid miles of nothing, but her own furious, humiliated thoughts for company, because if she climbed into that wagon right now, in front of God and Larkspur Crossing both, she thought she might finally come apart at the seams, and she'd be damned if she let this whole judgmental town watch it happen. So she walked, because her legs were shaking, but they'd carry her anyway, because her eyes stung, but she wasn't going to let a single tear fall, where anyone from that quilting circle might catch sight of it, through a window, because every single word Mrs. Pruitt had said kept looping through her head, bought, what's the going rate? And she couldn't outrun the words exactly, but she could at least outwalk the room they'd been spoken in. The town watched her go. She felt it. Lace curtains twitching in front windows. A face or two at the mercantile glass. She didn't slow her pace for any of it. By the time Larkspur Crossing had shrunk to a smudge of steeple and rooftop behind her, and the road opened up into flat gray prairie on both sides, the tears finally came, and she let them, because there was nobody left out here to see. Which was almost worse, somehow. Crying alone on an empty road felt like a smaller, sadder thing than crying somewhere a person might at least be found. Holt was on the porch when she came up the lane, an hour and change later, boots caked in mud, hands shaking from cold, and everything else besides. He was down the steps before she'd made it halfway up the drive. What happened? She told him. Every word, every sneer, the way the whole room had laughed, the way she'd stood and spoken and walked out with her chin level, and then walked 2 solid miles home rather than let Ezra see her face, before she had it back under some kind of control. His face, listening, went hard in a way she hadn't seen from him before. Not angry exactly, colder than that. Controlled, the way a fire goes controlled right before it's about to be turned loose on something that deserves it. They won't speak to you like that again, he said. You can't control what an entire town says, Holt. No. He took her hand, the first time he'd touched her, since she'd stepped down off the porch that morning, and his grip came warm and solid and entirely real against the cold still clinging to her skin. But I can make certain they hear me louder than they hear each other. What does that mean? It means I've let this town whisper about you for months now, and I've let it slide, because I thought quiet dignity would wear them down eventually. It hasn't. So. His jaw set, resolved, a man arriving somewhere he'd clearly been circling for some, while without quite admitting it to himself. So I stopped being quiet. She looked at him, saw the resolve sitting there, plain as anything. What are you going to do? Something I should have done from the start. He squeezed her hand, gentle, though there was nothing gentle in the set of his jaw. Trust me. She nodded. Yes. He didn't let go of her hand. She didn't let go of his either, and they stood there together on that porch as the light went from gray to blue to nearly dark, 2 people bound by vows neither had chosen, who had somehow, months now, a burned barn, and one cruel afternoon later, arrived at something that felt, for the first time, indistinguishable from choosing each other after all. A basket appeared on the porch rail the next morning, before either of them was properly awake. A dozen eggs, a jar of preserves, and a note folded twice, and signed, the handwriting careful, and cramped like a woman and used to putting her own thoughts down on paper. Not everyone in that room agreed with what was said yesterday. Some of us were only too frightened to say so out loud. I'm sorry for my silence, if nothing else. A friend. Josie read it twice, sitting on the porch steps in the cold morning light, and felt something unexpected loosen in her chest. Any notion who left it? Holt asked, coming out to find her there. None. She turned the note over, as if the blank back of it might yield an answer the front hadn't. Which is its own kind of message, I suppose. Whoever it was isn't ready to be known for kindness yet. Not out loud. Not where Mrs. Pruitt might hear of it. Small towns, Holt said, settling beside her, aren't always as united in their cruelty as they look from the outside. Sometimes it's just the loudest voice in the room that gets mistaken for the whole room's opinion. Josie thought about that a long while, turning the ensign note over in her hands. Thought of the dozen women at that quilting circle who'd laughed along with Mrs. Pruitt's cruelty rather than risk becoming its next target. thought, too, that laughter born of fear wasn't quite the same thing as laughter born of true conviction, and that maybe, underneath all that careful, cowardly silence, there were more friends in Larkspur Crossing than she'd let herself believe the day before. She didn't know it yet, sitting there with a basket of eggs and an unsigned note, but that small, quiet kindness would matter more than she could presently guess, because courage, she was slowly coming to understand, rarely arrived all at once in a person. It arrived in pieces. A basket left at dawn. A note signed only a friend. And, given enough time and enough proof laid out plain in the open, sometimes even a whole church hall's worth of women finding, at last, the nerve to stand up and say they'd been wrong. That night, Josie couldn't settle. Kept turning Mrs. Pruitt's words over even in the quiet of her own room. The way a tongue keeps finding a sore tooth no matter how many times a person tells it to leave the thing alone. She found Holt downstairs, same as the night of the photograph, sitting by a low fire that had mostly burned to embers. Couldn't sleep either? She asked, settling beside him. Kept thinking about that room full of women, he admitted. Kept thinking I should have been standing in it. Should have walked you there myself instead of trusting a wagon, and Ezra to catch you after. I wanted to go alone. I know. Doesn't mean it sits easy with me. She studied his profile in the low firelight, the tired set of his shoulders, and felt something shift in her chest. Something that had been building slow for weeks, and had finally, that afternoon, standing in a room full of cruel smiles, found its footing. Holt, thank you, for not once, in all this time, making me feel like I owed you gratitude for any of this. Not the house, not the safety, none of it. She looked down at her own hands. Mrs. Pruitt asked how it felt to be bought, and the honest answer is it doesn't feel like that at all. Not with you. It never has. He turned to look at her fully then, firelight catching the lines of his face, the careful stillness she'd once mistaken for coldness now looking, to her, like nothing so much as a man holding something precious, with exactly the right amount of care. Josephine. Her name said soft like it cost him something to say it plain. I need to tell you something, and I'd rather say it here tonight than let it sit unsaid another week. Her breath caught. I didn't expect to feel anything for you beyond duty, he said. Told myself going into this that decency would be enough, that I'd keep you safe, keep the peace, and call the arrangement a fair one, if it came to nothing more than that. He paused. It's become more than that. I don't rightly know when it happened. Maybe the storm. Maybe the porch the night I showed you Anna's photograph and you didn't flinch away from any of it. Maybe today, hearing what that room said to you and wanting to burn the whole church down around their ears for it. Holt, I'm not finished. A ghost of a smile, there and gone. I'm telling you I've come to care for you, Josephine Sterling. Not out of loneliness. Not out of duty. Because of who you are, plain and simple, and I didn't want another day to go by with you not knowing it. Josie sat very still, her heart going fast, and light in her chest, and found, for once, that she had no clever answer ready, no careful words held in reserve. Just the truth sitting there plain as his had been. I've come to care for you too, she whispered. I think I have, for longer than I've let myself admit. He reached over, brushed a strand of hair back, from her face, gentle, the same careful touch he used on green horses, and burned barns, and everything else he meant to protect. Then we fight for this, he said. Not just the land, not just the claim, this, whatever this has become. Yes, she said, we fight for this. Neither of them said anything more that night. Didn't need to. They sat by the dying fire a long while, her head finding his shoulder, without either of them deciding it should. And Josie let herself believe, at last, that whatever came next, she wasn't facing it as a bargain paid for. She was facing it as a woman loved. Ezra rode for Wichita a third time the following week, and this time he came back with something more than names and dates. He came back with a signature. County recorder let me sit with the original filing a good long while, Ezra said, spreading a copied page across the kitchen table, careful, like it might tear, if he handled it too rough. This here's Elias Calloway's mark on the 1861 claim. And this, he laid a second paper beside it. This is the mark on a quitclaim filed this past August, supposedly releasing the water right entire, signed over free and clear. Josie leaned in close, comparing the two signatures side by side, and felt her stomach drop clean through the floor. Papa didn't sign that. No, Ezra agreed. He surely didn't. Look at the sea. Look at the way it loops. Man's had 30 years to develop a hand, and this second one doesn't match it any more than my hand matches the Queen of England's. Forged, Holt said. Flat. Final. The word landing in the room like a dropped plate. Forged, Ezra confirmed, and filed proper, with a notary's seal on it besides, which means somebody paid a notary to look the other way, or paid him outright for a false witnessing. Either way, it's a crime plain enough a judge won't need much convincing, once it's laid out proper in front of him. Josie sat back, feeling something like relief, and fury tangled up together in her chest, twin flames feeding off the very same fuel. Who's the notary? She asked. Ezra's face went grim. Man works out of the same building as Randall Pruitt's bank, he said. Shares a wall with his office. Near enough. Randall Pruitt, as it happened, was already carrying a weight of his own by then, though nobody at the Sterling Ranch had cause to know it yet. He'd stood in his own bank office 3 days prior, watching Garrett Voss lay out the next stage of the plan. Pressure the county assessor quietly to reappraise the Sterling holdings ahead of a tax season that could be made to run inconveniently short on a rancher who didn't have the ready cash to cover a sudden increase, and felt, for the first time in 2 years of quiet, profitable cooperation with the man, something twist uneasy in his gut. Because a forged signature was one thing. A man could tell himself a great many comforting lies about a forged signature, if the money kept arriving regular, and the risk stayed theoretical. But burning a man's barn, that had crossed a line even Randall Pruitt, not a brave man by any honest account, wasn't entirely at peace with having helped build the road toward. He hadn't said any of that to Voss, hadn't found the nerve, just nodded along, same as always, and gone home to his wife, that evening unable to eat more than a few bites of his own supper, and lain awake along, while staring at the ceiling, turning over a question he didn't yet have the courage to answer. What happens to a man who helps build a fire when the fire finally comes looking for him too? Elias Calloway came to the ranch again the following Sunday, this time with a proposal of his own. I want to ride to the county seat myself, he told Holt and Josie both, over coffee gone cold in the late morning light. Lay the forged claim in front of the district judge personally. A father testifying to his own daughter's forged signature carries weight a hired lawyer's letter never will. It's a 2-day ride, Holt said, and Voss will hear of it inside a day, once you're seen leaving. Let him hear. Something had settled into Elias Calloway these last weeks, Josie thought, watching him. Some of the old stoop gone out of his shoulders, some of the shame replaced by a harder, cleaner resolve. I spent 2 years letting that man ruin me quiet. I don't intend to spend a third one letting him do it to my daughter and her husband both while I sit safe at home and call it somebody else's fight. It is somebody else's fight, Josie said, gentle. You don't have to carry all of it yourself, Papa. I know I don't have to. He met her eyes steady, the first time in months she'd seen him look at her, without an ounce of the old shame clouding it over. I want to. There's a difference, Josephine, same as you told that room full of women. I mean, to earn back a portion of what I cost you. This is where I start. Josie was alone at the ranch 2 afternoons later, Holt gone to the county seat with her father's testimony in hand, Ezra out checking the north fence, the hands scattered across the far pastures, when she heard a horse in the yard that didn't belong to anyone she knew. She went still at the kitchen window. Because it wasn't Holt's gelding. Because it wasn't Ezra's mare either. Because the rider sat easy in the saddle, unhurried, the way a man sits, when he isn't worried about being caught at whatever he's come to do. She reached for the rifle propped by the door, before she'd fully decided to. The man didn't dismount, just walked his horse in a slow half-circle around the yard, taking his time, looking at the barn, the house, the fence line, like he was memorizing the shape of the place for later use. Josie watched him, through the gap in the curtain, heart hammering. Rifle held the way Holt had taught her. Steady, both hands, though she prayed, with everything in her she wouldn't need to prove she remembered the lesson. He never came to the door, never called out, just sat his horse in her yard a long, unbearable 5 minutes, looking his fill, before he finally turned the animal, and rode off north unhurried, toward the very ridge that had started all of this. Josie stood at that window along, while after the dust had settled, rifle still gripped tight, her whole body shaking, with the particular kind of fear that only arrives after the danger's already passed, and a person finally has room to feel the whole weight of what almost happened, because he hadn't needed to say a single word, because a man sitting silent in her yard, taking his time, looking his fill, said everything Garrett Voss wanted said, without ever risking a single sentence that could be repeated back to a judge. She didn't tell Holt right away, when he rode in that evening, tired from the long ride to the county seat and back. Waited until supper was cleared, until the house had settled quiet around them, because she didn't want fear to be the very first thing he came home to, after a hard day's work on their behalf. But she told him before bed. Watched his face go, through the same careful, controlled fury she'd seen the night of the fire. You should have sent word. Ezra could have ridden back. I handled it. Josephine, I handled it, Holt. She said it steady, though her hands, she noticed, still hadn't fully stopped their trembling even hours later. I stood at that window with the rifle you taught me to shoot, and I didn't fire it because he never gave me cause to, and I didn't run either because this is my home now, same as yours, and I won't be chased out of it by a man too cowardly to even knock on the door. Something in Holt's face shifted at that, fear for her still plain as anything, but underneath it, unmistakable, something that looked a great deal like pride. All right, he said quietly. All right, Josephine, but no more alone afternoons, not till Sunday's behind us. Agreed? Agreed, she said, and meant it, though the fierce, protective anger sitting new and unfamiliar in her own chest told her plainly that whatever ground Garrett Voss thought he was gaining by riding silent through her yard, he'd very likely miscalculated exactly how much fight he'd stirred awake in doing it. Garrett Voss rode out to the Sterling Ranch one final time, before the month was through, and this visit carried none of the easy, unhurried charm of the last. Holt, curt nod. No hat tipped to Josie this time, no compliment offered about married life agreeing with her. I understand you've been making inquiries. County Recorder's office, a notary's office besides. Have I? Don't play games with me. I respect you a great deal more than that. Voss's voice had gone flat, all the syrup boiled clean out of it. I'll be plain, since plain seems to be what you prefer. I've built something here worth a great deal of money to a great many interested parties. Railroad men. Investors who don't care for their names appearing in a county courthouse. I'd advise you to consider carefully whether digging further serves you, or whether it simply invites trouble you haven't yet seen the shape of. Is that a threat? It's a caution, from a man who'd genuinely rather not see this turn uglier than it already has. Voss's eyes flicked, briefly, toward the rebuilt section of the hay barn, still raw-timbered, unweathered against the older wood around it. Barns burn easy out here. Cattle scatter easy in a storm nobody sees coming. A man in your position ought to think carefully about how much he's willing to risk proving a point that a quiet settlement could resolve a great deal more comfortably. Josie, standing in the doorway, felt her whole body go cold and still. Holt didn't move, didn't flinch, just looked at Voss, with an expression Josie had come to recognize this past month. The look of a man doing careful, silent math on exactly how much rope another man had left himself to hang with. You've got until Sunday, Voss said, when Holt offered nothing back. Withdraw your inquiries. Sign the quarter section over quiet, and I'll see to it this whole unpleasant business simply fades. Refuse, and I promise you, Holt, whatever happened to that barn will look like a kindness compared to what comes next. He turned his horse without waiting for an answer, and rode off down the lane, and Josie came out, onto the porch beside her husband, shaking, furious, terrified, all three at once. Sunday, she said. That's 4 days. I know. What are we going to do? Holt watched the dust of Voss's departure settle slow over the lane. His jaw set in a line she'd come to know meant a decision had already, quietly, been made. We're going to be ready for him, he said. Sunday, in front of the whole town, where he can't threaten a burned barn or a scattered herd, without every soul in Larkspur Crossing watching him do it. The church. The church. He turned to her, and there was something in his face now that hadn't been there a month before. Not just tenderness, not just resolve, but a kind of fierce, protective certainty that made her believe, standing there on that porch with 4 days left on a madman's deadline, that they might actually survive what was coming. Same room that watched you marry me a stranger. It'll watch us finish this too. All of it. In the open, where lies like Voss's don't hold up half, so well as they do in shadow. And if it goes wrong, then it goes wrong together, Holt said. Same as everything else has, since the day you walked down that aisle in a dress that wasn't yours. Josie looked north toward the ridge that had started all of this, toward water rights and forged signatures, and a barn still smelling faintly of smoke, weeks after the fire, and felt, underneath the fear, something steadier taking root. For days. Then Sunday would come, whether either of them was ready for it or not, and Larkspur Crossing was about to learn exactly how loud Holt Sterling could make himself heard, when he finally decided silence had gone on long enough. Friday morning, Holt saddled up before light and rode out alone, and didn't say where, and Josie didn't ask because she'd learned by now that some things he needed to do quiet and would tell her of in his own time. He came back near dusk, having called on 6 different families across the county. Men who'd sold grain at a loss 2 seasons running to a broker they'd since learned was Garrett Voss operating under a hired agent's name. Men who'd never put the pieces together until Holt laid it out plain on their own porches, the same way Ezra had laid it out on his kitchen table a week before. 3 of them will stand up Sunday, Holt told her, washing the trail dust off at the pump, weary clean through, but with something lit behind his eyes that hadn't been there at breakfast. Tell what happened to their own crops, their own notes at the bank. A forged signature's a strong thing to bring before a town. A pattern of ruin, laid out by 6 honest men who've got nothing left to lose by speaking it. That's stronger. You didn't tell me you meant to do this. Wasn't sure it would work until it did. He dried his hands, looked at her, with something like an apology in his face. Didn't want to raise your hopes on a plan that might have come to nothing. Holt Sterling. She said his name half exasperated. Half something warmer she didn't have a better word for yet. You don't have to carry every hard thing alone before you tell me about it. I thought we settled that. We did. A small, tired smile. Old habits, Josephine. A man spends enough years running his own outfit, making his own calls. It takes some doing to remember there's someone waiting on the other end of a decision now, wanting to be let in on the making of it. Then let me in. I am. He reached for her hand, damp from the pump water, and held it anyway. That's what Friday was. Letting 6 more voices in, so that come Sunday, it isn't just my word, and yours standing against a man with a banker in his pocket and a notary willing to lie for pay. Reverend Whitfield received them in the small back office of the church, that same evening, Bible open on the desk, before him though he hadn't been reading it, when they came in and listened to the whole of what Holt laid before him without once interrupting. When Holt finished, the old minister sat quiet a long moment, hands folded, studying them both, over the rim of his spectacles. You're asking to speak before the sermon, he said finally. In front of the whole congregation. I am. That's no small thing, Holt. A church service isn't a courtroom, whatever a man might wish to make of it on a given Sunday. No, sir. It's better than a courtroom for what I need. Holt held the old man's gaze steady. A courtroom's slow and quiet, and Voss has already shown he's not above burning what he can't buy, while the wheels of a court turn slow enough to let him. A congregation, though, a congregation hears a thing all at once, together, and can't unhear it after. I need Larkspur Crossing to hear this together, Reverend. All at once. Where nobody can pretend afterward they didn't know. Whitfield looked at Josie for a long moment then, something gentle and searching in his old eyes. "And you, Mrs. Sterling, are you prepared for what a room like that might say back once your husband finishes speaking?" Josie thought of the quilting circle, thought of Mrs. Pruitt's thin, cruel smile, and the laughter that had followed her cruelty round the table like a hungry thing. Thought, too, of standing up out of that chair anyway and walking out with her chin level and 2 miles of cold road that hadn't managed to break her after all. "I've already survived one room's worst opinion of me, Reverend," she said. "I expect I can survive another, if it means the truth finally gets said, where nobody can pretend not to have heard it." Whitfield studied her a moment longer. Then, slow, he nodded, and something like respect settled into the lines of his weathered face. "Sunday, then," he said. "You'll have your moment, Holt Sterling. I only hope the Lord sees fit to make it worth the risk you're both taking." "So do I, Reverend," Holt said quietly. "So do I." Randall Pruitt found Garrett Voss at the saloon that same night, sitting alone in the back corner with a bottle and a ledger, looking, for once, considerably less pleased with himself than usual. "You threatened him," Pruitt said low, sliding into the chair across from him without being asked, in front of his own house, his wife standing right there in the doorway. "I made him an offer with a deadline attached. There's a difference, Randall, if you'd bother learning it. There's men riding to 6 different farms this week, telling 6 different stories that all point back to the same broker. That was supposed to stay buried. Buried things have a way of surfacing," Voss said, unbothered, pouring himself another finger of whiskey. "When a man doesn't tend the grave properly. Which is precisely why I need you steady, come Sunday. Whatever Sterling means to say in that church, you say nothing. You confirm nothing. You sit in your pew same as any other honest banker, and you let the whole business play out as unproven talk, same as it's always been. And if he's got proof, does he?" Voss's eyes came up sharp, assessing. "Has your notary talked?" "My notary," Pruitt said, and something in his own voice surprised him with how tired it sounded, "is a man I've done business with for 11 years, Garrett. I don't relish finding out what he'll say under oath if a judge ever gets him in a room and asks him plain who paid for that quitclaim signature." "Then let's hope it doesn't come to that. Let's hope." Pruitt stood, his chair scraping loud against the saloon floor. "I helped you buy up grain contracts, Garrett. Told myself it was ordinary business, hard bargaining, nothing a banker hadn't seen 100 times before. I did not help you burn a man's barn, and I will not sit in a church pew Sunday and lie to Reverend Whitfield's face about a forged signature, with my own notary's seal pressed into it." Voss studied him a long moment, something cold moving behind his easy smile. "Careful, Randall," he said softly. "A man in your position has a great deal to lose too, should certain arrangements between us come to light. We've been partners in this a long while now." "I know exactly how long," Pruitt said, and walked out without looking back, though his hands, he noticed, climbing into his own wagon a few minutes later, hadn't fully stopped shaking since he'd sat down at that table. His wife was still awake when he got home, sitting up in the front room with her mending, and she looked at him a long moment when he came through the door, reading something in his face he hadn't managed to smooth away in time. "You look like a man who's seen his own funeral notice," Mrs. Pruitt said. "I'm tired, Eleanor. That's all." "You're not tired. You're frightened." She set the mending down, studying him with the same sharp attention she usually reserved for a quilting circle's worth of gossip. "This business with Sterling and that broker of yours, it's gone further than you meant it to, hasn't it?" "I don't know what you mean." "Randall." Just his name, but there was a warning folded into it, the kind a wife delivers, after 20 years of learning exactly how her husband behaves when he's hiding something. "I sat in that church hall and watched you go pale as a bedsheet when that girl walked out with her chin up. You've never once gone pale over an ordinary bank matter in all the years I've known you." He sat down heavily across from her. Didn't answer right away. "There's a barn that burned," he said finally low. "I didn't set the fire, Eleanor. I want you to know that plain. But I knew, before it happened, that Voss meant to press harder than a fair man presses. And I said nothing because I've got money tied up in this same scheme, and telling the truth would mean losing a great deal of it and possibly worse besides. His wife was quiet a long moment, turning that over. You've built our whole life on being a careful man, she said at last. Careful with money, careful with risk. I never once thought I'd hear you admit to being careless with another family's safety. I know it. Then fix it, Randall. Before Sunday, whatever's coming. Fix it while you've still got the choosing of how. She picked her mending back up, though her hands, Josie would have recognized, were shaking near, as badly as her husband's had been an hour before at the saloon. I did not marry a coward. I'd rather not learn this late in life that I did. Randall Pruitt sat along, while after she'd gone up to bed, staring into the banked fire, turning her words over same as he'd turned Voss's threat, over at the saloon and found, by the time the embers had gone to ash, that he still didn't know which way he'd choose when Sunday finally arrived to make him choose it. Saturday brought its own quiet dread. Ezra spotted a rider watching the ranch from the tree line north of the house twice that day. Gone both times before anyone could get close enough to put a name to him, but close enough and patient enough that nobody on the place mistook it for chance. Voss wants us rattled, Holt said, watching the empty tree line. From the porch that evening, rifle within easy reach against the rail beside him. Wants us second-guessing whether Sunday's worth the risk. Is it working? Josie asked. A little. He didn't pretend otherwise, which she'd come to trust in him more than any bravado could have earned. But rattled isn't the same as stopped, Josephine. We go through with it regardless. They set watches through the night in shifts, Ezra and two of the hands taking turns walking the fence line, with lanterns dimmed low, and nothing came of it beyond a long, sleepless night and a barn owl that startled half the household near out of their skins around 2 in the morning. But the waiting itself wore at everyone, the particular exhaustion of bracing for a blow that never quite lands, only to know it's still coming, simply delayed a few more hours. Saturday night, once the house had finally gone quiet, and even Ezra had turned in for what little sleep the watch schedule allowed him, Josie found Holt in her doorway. Her doorway, the one that had once worn a lock she turned every night for the better part of a week, the one that had stood open, unlocked, unremarked upon, for longer now than she could exactly recall the turning point of. Couldn't sleep, he said. Not quite an apology. Not quite anything else either. Neither could I. He didn't come in. Just stood there, the lamplight catching the tired lines of his face, and Josie understood, looking at him, that whatever tomorrow held, he was as frightened of it as she was, however carefully he kept, that fear folded away behind a rancher's steady hands and a trail boss's unshakable calm. Come sit with me, she said, just for a while. I don't want to be alone with tomorrow either. He crossed the room and sat on the edge of her bed, careful, the same careful distance he'd kept since the very first night, and she sat beside him, close enough now that their shoulders touched and neither one of them moved away from the contact. Whatever happens tomorrow, Holt said, quiet into the dark, I need you to know I don't regret a day of this. Not the wedding I never wanted the terms of. Not the fire, God help me, though I'd undo that in a heartbeat, if wishing made it so. None of it. Because it brought me you, Josephine, and I've come to think a man could survive a great deal worse than a burned barn and a banker's threats so long as he gets to survive it standing next to the right person. I don't regret it either, she said, and found, saying it, that it was entirely true. Truer than she'd have believed possible months ago, standing at that altar too frightened even to look at the man waiting for her. I used to think I'd been given no choice in any of this. I don't think that anymore. I think I was given the hardest possible way toward a choice I'd have made anyway, if anyone had simply asked me first. He turned to look at her then, close in the lamplight, and something passed between them that neither one of them rushed to name, because some things, she was learning, didn't need naming right away. They just needed to be allowed to sit there a while, quiet and real, between two people who had stopped, somewhere along the road, from a forced altar to a threatened barn, being strangers to each other at all. He reached up, brushed his thumb, gentle, along her cheek. Tomorrow, he said, Whatever that room says or does, you won't face it as a bargain, Josephine. You'll face it as my wife, as a woman I love. I should have said that plainer, sooner. I'm saying it now. Her breath caught somewhere behind her ribs. I love you too, Holt Sterling, she whispered. I think I have for weeks. I was only waiting for the courage to say it out loud. He didn't kiss her that night. Didn't need to, not yet. Some promises, she thought, were better sealed with patience than haste, and they had, after everything, finally earned the right to take their time about it. He simply stayed a while longer, her head against his shoulder, his arms settled careful around her, and they sat together in the lamplight until the fear of tomorrow had shrunk down to something they could both, at last, bear the weight of. Sunday morning came in clear and cold, the first real frost of the season silvering the grass beyond the porch rail, and Josie woke before the light, with her heart already racing, though whether from fear or something closer to resolve, she couldn't entirely say. Holt was already dressed when she came downstairs, his good coat brushed clean, a folded set of papers tucked careful into his breast pocket, the forged signature, the honest one beside it for comparison, Ezra's notes, her own careful record of 2 years of undercut grain prices, everything they'd built these past weeks laid out, and ready to be spoken aloud in front of God and Larkspur Crossing both. Ready? He asked. She thought of the borrowed dress, and the stranger who'd waited for her at that altar with his hat in his hands and stillness in his eyes, that she'd once mistaken for cruelty, and had come, since, to understand as something else entirely. A man's careful, patient way of making room for someone he hadn't yet earned the right to love, but had set about earning anyway, one locked door and one warm biscuit, and one storm-soaked laugh at a time. Ready, she said. Ezra brought the wagon around. Elias Calloway was waiting for them already at the church steps. When they arrived, 3 other ranchers beside him, grim-faced and resolved, men who'd driven half the night to be standing there, when the doors opened. Reverend Whitfield met them at the entrance, Bible in hand, and looked at the small, determined gathering with something like solemn pride. The congregation's near full already, he said quietly. Word travels fast in a small town, Mrs. Sterling. I suspect half of Larkspur Crossing has heard by now that something's coming. Josie looked past him, through the open doors, at the packed pews beyond, at faces turning already to watch them arrive. Some curious, some hostile, one near the front, belonging to Mrs. Pruitt herself, pale and watchful beside a husband, who would not quite meet anyone's eye. And somewhere among those faces, she knew, sat Garrett Voss, waiting, no doubt, with his easy smile already prepared, entirely unaware of exactly how loud a quiet man could make himself heard. Once he'd finally decided silence had gone on long enough, Holt took her hand. Together, he said. Together, she echoed, and they walked up the church steps side by side, into whatever Sunday had waiting for them. Months now, one forged signature and one burned barn removed from the frightened, borrowed-dress bride who had once walked that same aisle alone. The church was fuller than Josie had ever seen it, fuller than her own wedding even, and that day had drawn half the county out of pure curiosity alone. Every pew packed, standing room 3 deep along the back wall. And at the center of it, near the front, Garrett Voss sat, with his hat in his lap, and his smile already arranged, easy as ever, like a man who'd come simply to enjoy a Sunday service, and hadn't the faintest notion anything unusual was about to unfold around him. Josie felt Holt's hand tighten briefly around hers, as they came up the aisle. Not fear, something steadier. A man bracing himself the way he'd once braced against a storm bearing down on open pasture. Not to avoid it, because there was no avoiding it, but to meet it standing. They took their seats near the front, beside Elias and the 3 ranchers who'd ridden through half the night to be here. Josie caught Mrs. Pruitt's eye across the aisle, pale, drawn, her hands twisted tight in her lap, and beside her Randall Pruitt, staring straight ahead at nothing at all, a man doing everything in his power not to be looked at. Reverend Whitfield climbed to the pulpit, opened his Bible, began the service same as any other Sunday. A hymn, a reading, the familiar cadence of Scripture rolling out over the packed room. Josie barely heard a word of it, because her whole body was a held breath, because every second, That past felt like a fuse burning down towards something neither she nor Holt could fully control once it was lit. Because Garrett Voss sat 20 feet away, still smiling, and she couldn't shake the fear that his smile meant he already knew how this was going to end, and it wasn't going to end the way they'd planned. Stop it, she told herself. He doesn't know. He can't know. The hymn ended. The congregation settled. Josie's hands had gone cold in her lap despite the packed warmth of the room. She pressed them flat against her skirt, the way she'd learned to do in that quilting circle weeks before, and tried to steady her breathing to match the slow, ordinary rhythm of a Sunday service that was about to become anything but ordinary. Because this was the same church, the very same pews, the very same stained glass throwing colored light across the same worn floorboards, where she'd once stood terrified in a borrowed dress. Because months ago she'd stood here a stranger's bride, and today she was about to stand here again, this time as a woman who'd chosen to fight for what that stranger had become to her. Which meant everything. Which meant she couldn't let her hands shake the way they wanted to. Which meant whatever came next, she owed it to Holt, to her father, to the 3 tired ranchers who'd ridden through the night on her behalf, to sit up straight and meet whatever this Sunday brought without flinching. Reverend Whitfield closed his Bible, slow, and looked out over the room. Before this morning's sermon, he said, Mr. Sterling has asked leave to address the congregation on a matter of some gravity. I've granted that leave. I'd ask you all to extend him the same patience you'd extend any man standing where he's about to stand. A murmur went through the pews. Voss's smile didn't so much as flicker. Holt rose. He walked to the front slow, unhurried, a folded sheaf of papers held in one hand, and turned to face the room he'd lived among his whole adult life. The room that had watched him marry a stranger months back, that had whispered bought behind gloved hands, that had let a woman he loved walk out of a quilting circle alone rather than stand up on her behalf. Most of you know, Holt began, voice carrying easy to the back wall without needing to be raised, that I married Josephine Calloway under an arrangement brokered by a man named Garrett Voss. Some of you have called it a bargain, called her bought. His eyes swept the room, steady, unhurried. I'm here this morning to tell you the truth of what that bargain actually was. Voss's smile had gone very still. Months ago, I believed I was helping a family in hard times, and taking a wife I hoped might one day come to care for me, same as I'd come to care for her. Holt's gaze found Josie for one brief, steadying second before returning to the room. What I've since learned is that Garrett Voss spent 2 years engineering that family's ruin on purpose. Buying up grain contracts, undercutting honest men at auction, until they couldn't cover their own notes. Not out of ordinary hard business but deliberate patient design, because Elias Calloway held a water claim on my northern pasture, filed 30 years back, and never properly dissolved, and Mr. Voss meant to acquire it the cheapest way he knew how, through a marriage that looked from the outside like kindness. A ripple went through the congregation. Mrs. Pruitt's hands had gone white around each other. I don't ask you to take my word alone, Holt continued. He turned toward the 3 ranchers seated near the front. These men can tell you, in their own words, what happened to their own crops these past 2 seasons, under the very same broker's hand. One by one they stood, told it plain, dates, prices, the slow, deliberate squeeze of a market rigged against them by a single patient buyer nobody had thought to connect, until Holt Sterling rode out to their porches and laid the pattern in front of them. The room had gone dead silent by the time the 3rd man sat back down. Voss rose then, unhurried, brushing invisible dust from his coat sleeve, his smile stretched thin but holding. A remarkable story, he said, pleasant as ever, though something underneath the pleasantness had gone brittle. Difficult market seasons aren't uncommon, gentlemen. I fail to see how ordinary hard bargaining amounts to the conspiracy Mr. Sterling seems intent on painting for this congregation. 3 men, same broker, same pattern 2 seasons running. Coincidence, Mr. Sterling. Nothing more. Coincidence doesn't buy a water claim through a marriage contract. Voss's smile held, though something behind his eyes had gone very still. A serious accusation. Have you proof of it? or merely a wife's overheard fragment of a saloon conversation she wasn't meant to hear. Josie felt her whole body go rigid at that, the casual, dismissive cruelty of it, tossed off easy as anything meant to shrink her back down to something small and unreliable in front of the whole congregation. "I have proof," Holt said. Quiet. Final. "Do you?" "Ordinary hard bargaining," Holt continued, unmoved. "Doesn't require a forged signature." The room went stiller still. Holt unfolded the papers in his hand, held up two side by side. "This is Elias Calloway's genuine mark, filed on the original water claim in 1861. This second document, filed this past August purporting to release that same claim entire, bears a signature that doesn't match it. Not in the loop of the letter. Not in the pressure of the hand. A forgery witnessed and sealed by a notary who shares an office wall with the very bank that financed Mr. Voss's grain scheme." Every eye in the church turned, as one toward Randall Pruitt. He sat very still. Josie watched him, watched the color drain out of his face inch by inch, the way water drains, from a basin once the plug's been pulled. Because this was the moment. Because he'd known, since the saloon, since his own wife's warning by the fire, that Sunday would arrive whether he was ready for it or not. Except knowing a reckoning is coming, and standing inside the actual weight of it, in front of a packed church, wearing his own good coat, and his own careful reputation, turned out to be two entirely different animals. "Randall," Reverend Whitfield said, gentle, from the pulpit, "is what Mr. Sterling says true?" The silence that followed went on long enough that Josie thought, for one terrible moment, that he might simply refuse to answer at all. That he might sit there, pale and silent, and let the whole thing hang unresolved. Beside him, Mrs. Pruitt reached over, took her husband's hand. "Tell them, Randall," she said, quiet, but not so quiet the front pews didn't hear it. "I did not marry a coward. Don't make me learn otherwise in front of the whole town." Randall Pruitt closed his eyes a moment. When he opened them, something had settled in his face. Fear still, but underneath it, finally, something that looked like resolve. He stood. "It's true." His voice came out rough, unpracticed at confession. "All of it. I financed the grain purchases through the bank at Mr. Voss's arrangement, and I knew inside the first season, that the pattern wasn't honest business. I told myself it was. I let myself believe it because the money was good, and because I am, God forgive me, a careful man who has never once in his life found the courage to be a brave one, when courage was called for." "Randall," Voss's voice cracked through, sharp warning. "And the notary," Pruitt continued, louder now, not looking at Voss at all, "signed that quitclaim under my direction at Mr. Voss's request, knowing full well the mark on it wasn't Elias Calloway's own hand. I can produce him. He'll confirm it if a judge asks him plain, because I intend to ask him myself, today, before I lose whatever remains of my own nerve." Gasps rippled through the pews. Somewhere near the back, a woman's voice, Josie couldn't place. "Whose?" said Lord have mercy, soft and stunned. Garrett Voss stood very still in the aisle, and for the first time, since Josie had known him, the easy smile was entirely gone. "You sanctimonious fool," Voss said low to Pruitt, though the whole church could hear it. "You'll ruin us both." "I'll ruin myself," Pruitt said. "You ruined yourself the day you decided a man's family debts were fair game for a decade-old grudge that had nothing to do with any of them." The word grudge landed strange in the silent church, and Josie saw Holt's head come up sharp at it. "What grudge?" Holt said. "Explain yourself, Voss, in front of this whole congregation, since you seem so intent on being heard." Voss turned, looked at Holt a long moment, something old and bitter surfacing behind his eyes, years of carefully banked resentment finally finding a crack wide enough to escape through. "You want the truth of it?" Voss said. "Here it is plain, since apparently nothing less will satisfy this room. 15 years ago, I partnered with a grain merchant out of Abilene named Thomas Whitcomb. Invested every dollar I had in a shipping venture he swore was sound. Collapsed within the year. Whitcomb walked away with his fortune intact, having quietly withdrawn his own stake weeks before the collapse, while I was left with nothing. Nothing, Sterling. 15 years I spent clawing my way back from that ruin, one grain contract at a time, while Thomas Whitcomb lived out his days comfortable and untouched by any consequence at all. The church had gone utterly silent. Thomas Whitcomb, Holt said, slow, something dawning in his face, that looked to Josie like the ground shifting beneath a man who'd thought he was standing on solid rock. Anna's father. Your late wife's father, Voss confirmed, and there was something almost satisfied in the way he said it, cruel and unhurried. A man finally unburdening a wound he'd carried silent for a decade and a half. I learned, some years back, that his daughter had married a rancher building himself a considerable fortune off land partly financed, in its earliest years, by her own dowry. Whitcomb money, however many times removed. I told myself I'd let it lie. Anna Sterling never wronged me. I had no quarrel with a dead woman. His eyes cut, sharp and cold, toward Holt. But when I learned there was an old water claim sitting forgotten on your northern boundary, and a debt-ridden neighbor, whose daughter could carry that claim straight into your household through marriage. I confess, Sterling, the opportunity to finally collect something from that family, after 15 years of watching Whitcomb's blood prosper, while I rebuilt, from ash, proved more tempting than I could resist. Josie felt the words land in her chest like stones dropped into still water, ripples spreading out in every direction, because it had never, not once, been about her at all. Not really. Not even about Elias or the drought or 2 years of quiet grain sabotage. It had been about a grudge 15 years buried, waiting patient in the dark for exactly this kind of chance. A widower's loneliness, a desperate father's debt, a marriage that could carry an old bitterness home to roost, without ever once announcing itself as revenge. She looked at Holt, watched him absorb it. Anna's father's old business failure, a debt he'd never known existed, reaching 15 years across time to nearly cost him everything twice over, once through grief and once, nearly, through fire. His hand found hers, without either of them deciding it should. She held on, because there was nothing to say, yet that wouldn't sound small against a revelation that large. Because some things a person simply has to sit inside a moment, before they can be spoken of at all. And because she understood, watching his jaw work silent against whatever he was holding down, he needed her hand steady in his a great deal more than he needed her words right now. Holt stood very still at the front of that church, and Josie watched something move across his face that she recognized. The same stillness she'd mistaken for coldness the day of their wedding, months and a lifetime ago. Except she understood it now for what it truly was. Not coldness at all. A man holding an enormous weight steady, so it wouldn't crush the people standing near him when it finally came down. Anna never wronged you, Holt said, quiet, into the silence Voss's confession had left behind. Neither did her father's daughter. Neither did mine. You built an entire scheme of ruin on a debt that was never rightfully anyone's to collect, but your own bitterness, Voss. That's not revenge. That's cowardice dressed up in a banker's suit and a patient man's smile. The back doors of the church opened then, cold morning light spilling in, and a man in a marshal's coat stepped through, unhurried, his badge catching the light. Holt had ridden 2 days to the county seat, Josie remembered, arranging exactly this. A witness to carry testimony, and a lawman to act on it, waiting in the wings for precisely this moment, should the confession Holt had gambled on actually arrive. Garrett Voss, the marshal said, his voice cutting flat, and official across the stunned congregation. I'll need you to come with me. There's a forged land document and a pattern of fraud here that a district judge is going to want explained under oath. For one long second, Voss's eyes cut toward the side door, and Josie's whole body went tight, certain he meant to run, certain this whole careful morning was about to end in a chase, through the churchyard instead of the quiet reckoning they'd planned for. He didn't run. Perhaps the marshal's hand, resting easy but ready near his own sidearm, decided the matter for him. Perhaps, after 15 years of carrying a grudge patient enough to wait a decade and a half for its moment, Garrett Voss simply hadn't the fight left in him to try outrunning a debt that had finally irrevocably come due. You'll regret this, Sterling, he said instead, low, as the marshal's hand closed around his arm. Whatever satisfaction you're taking this morning, a man builds nothing lasting on the ruin of another man's grievance. You'll learn that yet. Maybe, Holt said, but I'll learn it a free man on my own land, beside a wife who chose to stay. You'll learn whatever you've got left to learn from inside a cell, Voss. I know which lesson I'd rather sit with. Voss's eyes moved once around the church, the packed pews, the ranchers who'd testified against him, Randall Pruitt standing pale and finally irrevocably honest beside his wife, Holt Sterling standing steady at the front, with Josie's hand still folded in his, and something in his face finally entirely collapsed. Not into remorse. Josie didn't think a man like Garrett Voss had much remorse left in him to find. Into something closer to simple, exhausted defeat. 15 years of carefully tended grievance finally spent, with nothing left to show for it, but a marshal's hand closing firm around his arm. He didn't struggle further, didn't speak again, just walked out, through the church doors he'd walked in, through so easily an hour before, and the whole congregation watched him go in a silence, so complete Josie could hear her own heartbeat in it. For a long moment, after the doors closed, nobody in that church moved at all. Josie sat very still, Holt's hand still folded around hers, and felt the strange, hollow quiet that follows any storm once it's finally passed overhead. The disbelief that something so long feared could simply be over, resolved, carried out through a set of church doors by a marshal's steady hand. Around her, the congregation seemed to be working, through that same disbelief in their own fashion. A few soft murmurs breaking out here, and there, someone weeping quietly 2 pews back, the ordinary sounds of a room slowly remembering how to breathe. Then, slow, from a pew near the middle, an elderly woman rose. Josie recognized her vaguely, a widow named Clara Bishop, one of the oldest residents of Larkspur Crossing, a woman whose opinion carried more weight in that town than any 3 younger tongues combined. I have sat in this church, Mrs. Bishop said, her voice thin but carrying, and watched this congregation gossip a young woman half to tears, over a marriage none of us troubled ourselves to understand, before judging it. I was among the worst offenders. I'm an old woman and I hoped I'd learned better than that by now. I hadn't. She looked directly at Josie. I was wrong about you, Mrs. Sterling. I am sorry for it, plainly and without excuse. One by one, others followed. Not all of them. Josie noticed a few faces that stayed fixed forward, unmoved, unwilling yet to own their part in months of cruelty. But enough, more than enough to feel, sitting there with her hand still in Holt's like something in that room had genuinely permanently shifted. Mrs. Pruitt rose last, her husband still pale and silent beside her, and crossed the aisle to stand directly in front of Josie. I called you bought, she said, quiet, no trace left of the cruel, glittering smile she'd worn at the quilting circle. In front of the whole town. I knew it would wound you when I said it, and I said it anyway because cruelty dressed up, as concern felt safer than admitting I envied a young woman brave enough to walk into a stranger's house and make something honest of it, when I've spent 20 years too frightened to ask my own husband a single hard question. Her voice caught. I am sorry, Josephine. Truly. Whatever that's worth, months too late. Josie looked at her a long moment. Thought of the 2-mile walk home in the cold. Thought of the tears she'd let fall only once she was certain nobody from that room could see them. Then she stood and did something she hadn't planned, hadn't rehearsed, hadn't known she meant to do, until her arms were already moving. She embraced her. It's worth a great deal, Josie said, quiet, just for the 2 of them. More than you know. I'd rather have an honest apology late than a false kindness on time. Mrs. Pruitt's composure broke entirely then, and she wept, briefly unguarded, into a young woman's shoulder in front of half the county, and Josie held her, through it, and thought that perhaps this, more than the marshal's arrest, more than Voss's collapsing composure, was the truest ending this particular story could have asked for. Not vengeance, not triumph over a defeated enemy, just 2 women, on opposite sides of months' worth of cruelty, finding their way back to something like grace. When the room had settled again, Holt turned to Reverend Whitfield. One more thing, if you'll permit it. Whitfield, looking rather as though he'd rarely presided over a Sunday quite like this one, simply nodded and gestured him on. Holt reached into his coat, drew out a final folded document, different from the others, clean, freshly inked, a notary's proper seal pressed true, and honest into the corner of it. Most of you have heard, by now, the whole shape of what brought Josephine and me together, he said, turning to face the room once more, though his eyes, this time, stayed fixed on her alone. A forced arrangement, a desperate father, a scheme neither of us asked to be caught inside of. I won't pretend otherwise, and I won't stand here and dress up an ugly beginning as anything prettier than it was. He held up the document. This is the deed to the Northern Quarter section, the water claim that started all of this. As of this morning, it's registered in Josephine Calloway Sterling's name, hers alone, not because a scheme demanded it, and not because I owe her a debt I'm settling, because it was rightfully her father's claim to begin with, honestly earned 30 years, before any of us were tangled up in this business, and because she deserves to hold something in this county that belongs to her plainly, free and clear, whatever else does or doesn't stay tied to my name. Gasps, softer this time, moved through the pews. She can sell it, Holt continued, farm it herself, or walk away from it and from me any single day she chooses to. She is not my property. She never was. She's my wife because I've come, these past months, to love her plainly and completely, not because a forged document or a banker's scheme decided it for either of us. He turned fully to Josie then, and for a moment it was as though the whole packed church simply fell away, leaving only the two of them standing in the space, where a wedding neither had chosen had, somehow, slowly, become something neither of them wanted any longer to undo. Josie's heart was going, so hard she could feel it in her throat. Because every eye in that church was on her now. Because months ago she'd sat in a pew much like this one, mute, terrified, letting a room full of strangers decide what her marriage meant, without ever once asking her opinion of it. And because standing up now meant something different entirely, meant claiming her own voice in the very room that had once tried so hard to take it from her. Stand up, she told herself. Just stand. Her legs felt strange beneath her, half numb, the way they'd felt counting 14 floorboards toward a door she'd been too frightened to walk through. Except this time there was no door to run to, only a room full of faces waiting to hear what she'd say, and a husband beside her who'd just handed her, in front of all of them, the plainest proof imaginable that he'd never once wanted to own her. Josie rose, found her voice steadier than she expected, given how hard her heart was going. I came into this marriage with nothing, she said to the room, though her eyes stayed on Holt the whole while. No choice in it, no say in the terms. I stood at that altar counting floorboards, wondering if I could run, and I couldn't because there was nowhere left for me to run to. She took a breath. Holt Sterling gave me everything a scheme like Garrett Voss's was never built to survive giving anyone. Not land, not money, dignity. The simple, extraordinary gift of being asked what I wanted, instead of being told. She looked at him, and something in her chest, some final held-back thing, finally let go entirely. I'm staying, she said, because I choose to. Because he's a better man than this town, myself included, had the sense to recognize months ago. And because, her voice caught, steadied, because I love him, plainly, completely. However this marriage began, that's how it stands now, and I wanted the whole of Larkspur Crossing to hear me say it, the same way they heard every ugly word said against me these past weeks. She sat. Holt took her hand. The church was silent a long moment. Then Reverend Whitfield, his voice thick, with something he didn't try to hide, said simply, I believe that concludes our announcements for the morning. Let us pray. Outside, in the cold, clear light after the service, the congregation filed out slow, subdued, many of them stopping to press Josie's hand or murmur some awkward, sincere word of apology on their way past. That was a fine thing you did in there, Sterling, one of the ranchers said, shaking Holt's hand at the church steps. Wasn't about being fine, Holt said. Was about being right. Ezra waited by the wagon, grinning wide enough to crack his own weathered face in half. Told you patience'd win out over that fellow's schemes sooner or later. You told me no such thing, Ezra Boone. Well, I thought it plenty hard. Ought to count for something. Josie laughed despite everything, and Ezra's grin softened into something quieter, more serious, as he looked between the two of them. Known you a long while, Holt, he said. Since before Anna. Since the drives, since we buried men on the Red River crossing, and you were young enough it about broke something in you that took years mending. He glanced at Josie. Didn't think I'd see that particular something finish mending in my lifetime. Glad to be wrong about it. Wasn't your job to see it mended, Ezra? Wasn't my job, Ezra agreed. Was my honor watching it happen anyway. He tipped his hat to Josie, something warm and paternal in the gesture. Welcome to the family proper, Mrs. Sterling. Took the whole county to get you here, but here you are. Elias Calloway found his daughter last, waiting a little apart from the crowd, hat in his hand same, as it had been the morning of the wedding, though everything about the way he held it now was different. I'm proud of you, Josephine, he said. Prouder than I've any right to be, given how this all began. You gave me the hardest possible road toward the right ending, Papa. She embraced him and felt, for the first time, since that terrible morning months back, that the embrace carried nothing left in it, but plain, uncomplicated love. I've made my peace with that. I hope you can too. I'm working on it, he said, voice rough. Every day, a little more. You could work on it closer to home, Holt offered, coming to stand beside them. The old line shack up past the north pasture wants a caretaker, now that quarter's properly settled. Roof sound. Needs a man who knows the land to look after it. Elias looked between them, surprised. You're offering me work, after everything my debts nearly cost you. I'm offering my father-in-law a reason to live near his daughter and grandchildren, should the Lord see fit to grant us any, Holt said plain. The work's just an excuse if you want the truth of it. Josephine's missed you more than she's let on, these past months. I'd rather not watch her ride 2 counties, over every time she wants her father's company. Elias's eyes went bright, and he had to look away a moment, out toward the ridge, before he trusted his own voice again. I'd be glad of it, he said finally. More glad than I know how to say properly. He reached into his coat then, hesitant, and drew out a folded, worn piece of paper Josie recognized with a start. The letter she'd written him weeks before, the one she'd nearly torn up twice before sending, the one that had admitted she wasn't certain, yet whether she'd forgiven him. I've carried this with me since the day it came, Elias said. Read it so many times the folds have gone soft. I wasn't sure, reading it the first time, whether it was a kindness or a wound, you writing to say you weren't certain of your own forgiveness yet. He looked at her, steady, older somehow than he'd looked even that morning. I understand it better now. You gave me the truth instead of a comfortable lie. That's its own kind of grace, Josephine, even when it doesn't feel like one at the time. Have I forgiven you, do you think? Josie asked, gentle. I find I'm no longer entirely certain myself, watching you stand here. I think, her father said, you've done something better than forgiving me outright. I think you've let me earn my way back to you, slow, the same patient way Holt earned his way to you these past months. That's harder won than simple forgiveness, and worth a great deal more for the winning of it. She embraced him again, and this time neither of them let go quickly, and Holt stood a little apart, giving them the moment, watching with the particular quiet satisfaction of a man who'd helped build a bridge 2 people badly needed, and hadn't known quite how to build alone. That evening, once the ranch had finally gone quiet, and the last of the well-wishers had driven off down the lane, Holt and Josie sat together on the porch, the same porch where a photograph had once been shared, where a farewell letter had once nearly been delivered, where a rifle had once been raised at tin cans catching the last gold light of an ordinary afternoon. It's a great deal to hold, Josie said, quiet, watching the stars come out over the north ridge. All of it. Thus, Anna's father. 15 years of a grudge none of us knew existed, until this morning. It is. Holt was quiet a moment, turning something over. I keep thinking about Anna, wondering if she ever knew her father dealt in ventures that ruined other men. Wondering if it would have troubled her, same as it troubles me now, learning it secondhand, and years too late to ask her about it directly. Does it change how you think of her? No. He said it without hesitation, sure of that much at least. She never chose her father's business dealings any more than you chose yours. I won't hold either of you responsible for debts neither of you incurred. He glanced at her. Strange, isn't it? Two women, 15 years apart, both nearly undone by the very same old grudge, and neither one of them ever did a single thing to earn it. Strange, Josie agreed. And unfair. And over now, whatever else it cost to get here. Over now, Holt echoed, and reached for her hand, and they sat together along, while under a sky gone thick, with stars, the whole exhausting, terrifying, extraordinary day finally settling into something like peace between them. Randall Pruitt rode to the county seat himself that same afternoon alongside the marshal to give his formal testimony before a judge. A choice, everyone understood, that would likely cost him his position at the bank, and possibly a good deal more besides, once the full accounting of the grain scheme came to light. You didn't have to go today, Mrs. Pruitt told him at the edge of town before he rode out. You could have waited, consulted a lawyer first. I could have, Randall agreed. But I've spent 2 years waiting for the convenient moment to do the right thing, Eleanor, and there never was one. I'd rather go today, plain and unprepared, than wait one more week for courage that clearly wasn't coming on its own. She kissed him once, brief and fierce, in front of the whole departing congregation, and Josie, watching from a distance, thought that whatever punishment the law eventually settled on Randall Pruitt, he had already, in that single act of standing up in a packed church, earned back something considerably harder to reclaim than a bank position. His wife's plain, undisguised respect. Garrett Voss stood trial at the county seat 3 weeks later, in a courthouse considerably smaller and plainer than the packed church that had first exposed him, though the weight of the proceedings felt, to Josie, a great deal larger for all its plainness. She sat beside Holt in a hard wooden gallery bench, her father on her other side, and watched the county prosecutor lay out the case the way a careful mason lays brick. The forged quitclaim first, the mismatched signatures held up for the judge's own inspection, then Randall Pruitt's sworn deposition, then the notary himself, brought in under subpoena, sweating through his collar as he confirmed, haltingly, that yes, he had witnessed a signature he'd known full well wasn't genuine, because Mr. Voss had paid him handsomely to look the other way. Voss sat through it all, with his old composure mostly restored, though Josie noticed his eyes rarely left the middle distance, as though he'd already resigned himself to whatever verdict was coming, and had simply decided not to grant the room the satisfaction of watching him flinch through the details. 15 years is a long while to nurse a wound instead of letting it heal, the judge said before passing sentence, and a longer while still to spend building a scheme this patient, this deliberate, around the innocent lives of people who never once wronged you personally. This court does not find grievance, however old, however genuinely suffered, an excuse for fraud, arson, or the deliberate ruin of honest men's livelihoods. The judge sentenced Voss to a term at the state penitentiary, the exact length of which mattered a good deal less to Josie, in the end, than the plain fact of it being spoken aloud in an open courtroom, by a judge with no reason to favor either side in front of witnesses who could no longer be dismissed as gossip or grudge. Randall Pruitt's own case was heard separately, a week later. His cooperation, his voluntary confession, and Reverend Whitfield's own letter to the court speaking to his character in the years since counted for something, a fine, the loss of his position at the bank, and 2 years of probation, rather than the prison term the prosecutor had initially sought. Josie watched Mrs. Pruitt weep with relief in the courthouse hallway afterward, and thought that whatever else had come of this whole ordeal, it had at least given one marriage the chance to be rebuilt honest, from the ground up, same as her own. Whitcomb's daughter's marriage had, in the end, cost Garrett Voss everything he'd spent 15 years trying to reclaim. Holt didn't celebrate the verdict, exactly. Josie noticed that riding home, noticed the quiet, complicated stillness that settled, over him in the days after and understood, without needing it explained, that learning the whole shape of Voss's grudge had reopened something in him about Anna, about a marriage that had ended in grief long before this one had ever begun, and a father-in-law he'd never fully known, whose old business dealings had somehow reached across 15 years to nearly cost him a second wife too. "You're quiet," she said one evening, finding him again on the porch, a different photograph this time held loose in his hands. Not Anna's, but an old letter, brittle with age, that Josie recognized as having come from the small trunk of Anna's things still kept, careful, in the corner of Holt's room. "Thinking about her," he admitted. "About all of it. Strange, isn't it? A grudge 15 years old, and it very nearly cost me you, same as it already cost me her in its own roundabout way." "It didn't cost you me," Josie said, settling beside him. "I tried. It didn't succeed." "No," he agreed, something easing in his face at that. "Didn't." He set the letter aside, reached for her hand instead. "Anna would have liked you," he said after a while. "I think. She had a stubborn streak of her own, same as you do. Wouldn't have tolerated a room full of cruel women any better than you did." "I'd like to think we'd have gotten on," Josie said, gentle. "Two stubborn women, refusing to be told who we were allowed to be." Holt huffed out something that was almost a laugh, and they sat together while on that porch, the past finally, quietly settling into its proper place. Not forgotten, never that, but no longer the thing standing between him and whatever came next. A few days later, Holt asked Josie to ride out with him to the small cemetery at the edge of Larkspur Crossing, and she understood, from the careful way he asked it, that this was a request that had taken him some courage to make. 2 headstones stood together beneath a young cottonwood tree, one for Anna, one small and plain beside it for the son who'd never drawn a single breath in this world. Holt knelt and cleared away the season's fallen leaves, careful, unhurried, and Josie stood a little apart, uncertain whether her presence here was welcome or intruding, until he glanced back and beckoned her closer. "I haven't brought anyone out here before," he admitted. "Not since she passed. Ezra knows where it is. Nobody else. Why bring me now? Because you're not separate from this anymore, Josephine. Whatever Voss's grudge was built on, whatever old wound reached across 15 years to nearly cost us everything, it started here in a way, with her father, with this ground." He looked at the headstone a long moment, felt wrong, somehow, letting you go on not knowing this place existed, after everything else we've carried together this year. Josie knelt beside him, laid a small bundle of the same prairie roses that had once wilted in her wedding bouquet, months and a lifetime ago, gathered fresh this time and meant entirely as a gift rather than an accident of circumstance. "Thank you for loving her well enough that it still hurts," she said, quiet. "I wouldn't trust a man who could set grief down so easy it left no mark at all." Holt looked at her, something raw and grateful moving across his face. Most women would find that a strange thing to say to a second wife. Most women haven't watched you carry a photograph out to a porch at midnight and hold it like it might still break your heart 5 years on, Josie said. "I don't want you to love me by loving her less, Holt. I never did. I just wanted room enough beside her memory to build something of my own." "You have it," he said, rough. "You've had it a while now, if I'm honest. I just hadn't found the right way to show you the whole of where it started." They stayed along, while at the little cemetery, the cottonwood's bare branches creaking soft overhead, and when they finally rode back toward the ranch, as the light went gold, and long across the prairie, Josie felt something settle between them that hadn't quite been settled before. Not just forgiveness for Voss's grudge or triumph over the scheme it had built, but a fuller, gentler kind of peace, the kind that only comes from finally being shown every corner of a person's grief, and finding, once shown it, that you love them more rather than less for having carried it so faithfully. The town came out to help rebuild the barn the following weekend, near 24 wagons rolling up the lane, before the sun had properly cleared the ridge, and Josie stood on the porch, that morning genuinely unable to speak for a moment, watching half of Larkspur Crossing arrive with lumber and tools and covered dishes for a noon meal nobody had asked them to bring. Didn't expect this, she admitted, as Mrs. Bishop directed a row of women setting up trestle tables in the yard. Small towns, Holt said again, echoing words he'd offered her once before, on a cold porch step, after a basket of eggs and an unsigned note, aren't always as united in their cruelty as they look from the outside. Sometimes they just need showing what the alternative looks like. Even Mrs. Pruitt came, though her husband, still working through his own probation, and the loss of his position, stayed home that day, uncertain of his welcome. She brought a pie and stood a little apart from the other women at first, uncertain herself until Josie crossed the yard and pulled her gently into the middle of the work. Hold this board steady, Josie said, handing her a length of raw lumber. I hear you're handier than you let on. Once somebody bothers asking. Mrs. Pruitt's answering smile came slow, but it came, and by the time the barn's new frame stood raised against the afternoon sky, hammered up plank by hands, that had, not so long before, mostly whispered cruelty behind gloved fingers, Josie understood that this, more than the courtroom verdict, more than the church confession, was what a town's true repentance looked like. Not a single grand apology. 100 small, ordinary hands showing up. That evening, once the last wagon had rolled off down the lane, and the new barn stood raw and honest against the darkening sky, Holt found Josie in the front room, standing before the faded blue curtain that had hung in that window since long before either of them had come to live beneath this roof. I keep meaning to ask you, he said, whether it troubles you, that curtain. Josie looked at it a long moment. Anna's careful stitching, faded now by years of sun, hung in a house that had, slowly, become as much Josie's own as it had ever been anyone else's. It doesn't trouble me, she said, honest. I think, if anything, I've come to be glad of it. A house ought to remember the people who loved it before we did. I wouldn't want it any other way. I've thought once or twice of taking it down. Don't. She reached out, touched the worn fabric, gentle. Leave it up. But, she hesitated. I'd like to add to it, if you'd allow me. Not replace what was there. Just add something of my own beside it. Holt watched her a long moment, something moving behind his eyes that looked to Josie a great deal like relief. The particular relief of a man who'd spent 5 years quietly afraid that loving again meant erasing what came before, and was only now, watching his second wife choose tenderness over erasure, beginning to understand it needn't be that at all. I'd like that, he said. Very much. The following week, Josie hung a second curtain beside the first. Plain cream muslin, nothing fancy, stitched by her own careful hand, through 3 evenings by the fire, and the 2 fabrics hung together in that window from then on, faded blue and honest cream, side by side, neither one crowding out the other. A house, Josie thought, watching the morning light move through both of them, could hold more than one kind of love at once, if the people living inside it were only brave enough to let it. Spring came early that year. February thawed into March, the last hard frost giving way to soft, green shoots pushing up, through soil gone dark and rich with thaw. The tulip bulbs Josie had planted her first October at Sterling Ranch came up first, bright red and yellow against the fence line, and she stood over them one morning, with dirt already under her nails, planting something new beside them. Apple saplings. A dozen of them, ordered special from a nursery 2 counties over. Their roots wrapped careful in damp burlap for the long wagon ride home. Those won't bear fruit for years yet, Holt said, coming to lean on the fence post and watch her work. I know. She pressed the soil firm around the last sapling's roots. Good thing I'm not planning on going anywhere. He smiled, easy now, unguarded, the smile of a man who'd stopped expecting every good thing to be temporary. Need any help? Always. They worked together through the morning, digging, setting roots, covering them gentle against the last chill still clinging to the ground, and by noon the whole north side of the garden was planted in neat, hopeful rows. Apple trees that wouldn't give a single fruit for years, tulips already blooming bright, and stubborn against a Kansas sky scrubbed clean by the last of winter. A letter arrived from Larkspur Crossing School Board that same week, addressed to Mrs. Josephine Sterling, and Josie read it twice at the kitchen table, before she quite believed what it said. The town's only schoolteacher had married and moved east that spring, leaving the schoolhouse without anyone to fill it come autumn term, and word had reached the board. Through Reverend Whitfield, Josie suspected, though the letter didn't say so outright, that Mrs. Sterling had once trained toward exactly such a position, before hard times had carried her family's plans in a different direction entirely. "They're asking if I'd consider it," she told Holt, disbelief still coloring her voice. "Teaching. The autumn term. Will you?" She looked up at him, searching his face for any trace of the old fear, that a husband might resent a wife's ambitions reaching past the boundaries of his own house, and found nothing there but plain, open pleasure on her behalf. "I asked you once," Holt said, "what you wanted before any of this happened to us. You said you wanted to teach. Told me you'd want to be asked again, even if the answer stayed the same." He reached across the table, took her hand. "I'm asking again, Josephine. What do you want?" "I want to teach," she said, and found, saying it aloud in her own kitchen, with no debt, no scheme, no forced arrangement standing between her and the wanting of it, that the words came out steady and sure and entirely her own. "I want to teach children their letters in that little schoolhouse and come home to you every evening after, and plant apple trees on the weekends, and grow old in this house watching both things bear fruit." "Then that's what you'll do," Holt said, simple as that, as though it had never once been in question. She wrote her acceptance that same evening and felt, sealing the envelope, something settle into place inside her that had been unsettled since the morning her father folded his good shirt, with shaking hands. The last piece of a life chosen rather than assigned, finally, fully her own. Elias found Holt alone at the corral one evening, that same spring, mending a bit of tack by lantern light, and settled onto the fence rail beside him, without needing to be invited. "Watched you a long while now," Elias said. "Since before the wedding, if I'm honest. Trying to work out what sort of man I'd handed my daughter to." "And what you decided? That you're the sort of man who doesn't need to raise his voice to be obeyed, or raise his fists to be respected. Rarer thing than folks give it credit for being." Elias turned the thought over a moment. "My own father wasn't like that. Ruled his house with volume and his hands both, and I spent half my own life unlearning it, not always successfully, if I'm honest with myself." "Where'd you learn different?" "Watching you, these past months, same as I said." Elias looked out over the darkening pasture. "A man doesn't need to own a person to be loved by them, Holt. Took me 60-some years, and nearly losing my daughter to a scheme of my own making, before I understood that plain. You seemed to understand it from the very first night, locking a door and handing her the key to it." Holt was quiet a moment, working the leather in his hands. "Wasn't wisdom," he admitted. "Wasn't some great understanding I arrived at on my own. I watched Anna's father, in his own way, treat people as things to be managed rather than loved. His business partners, his own daughter's dowry treated, as a tool rather than a gift. Didn't want to become that. Told myself the night before my wedding to Josephine that whatever else I got wrong, I wouldn't treat a person like property, the way I'd watched done to people I cared about. You succeeded. I had good reason to." Holt set the tack aside, looked toward the house, warm light spilling from its windows into the gathering dark. "She taught me as much of it as I ever taught myself, if we're being honest about where the credit belongs. A man doesn't learn to be loved well just by deciding to. Somebody's got to be patient enough to show him what it looks like, received properly, for the very first time." Elias nodded slow, something settled and peaceful in his weathered face. "I'm glad it was her that got to teach you," he said. "And gladder still it was you that got the chance to be taught." That evening, Holt and Josie walked the fence line together at sunset, out past the garden, out to the boundary between the land that had once been contested and the ranch that had slowly become simply home. "Want me to take the fence down?" Holt asked at the boundary line. "Now that it's all one holding, more or less, whatever the deed says on paper." Josie looked at the old wire, weathered now, strung true across ground that had nearly cost them everything. "Leave it," she said. "Why?" Because it reminds me I chose to cross it, she said. Every single day if I wanted to. Nobody made me. I choose it anyway. Holt looked at her a long moment in the fading gold light. This woman who'd come to him frightened and forced, who'd become, somewhere along a road neither of them had asked to walk, someone fierce enough to stand up in a packed church, and someone gentle enough to embrace the very woman who'd once wounded her. I'm proud of you, he said, quiet. I'm proud of us, she answered. Do you ever think on it? Holt asked after a while. What might have happened if Ezra hadn't ridden to Wichita that first week? If we'd never found the paper trail at all? Sometimes. Josie considered it honest, the way she'd learned to consider most things by now. I think we'd have found another way through eventually. Slower, maybe. Harder. But I don't think either of us was built to simply hand Voss what he wanted and call it settled. No, Holt agreed. I don't suppose we were. Do you regret any of it? The fighting, the fire, all of it, laid at my family's door, however unwillingly. He turned to face her fully at that, taking both her hands in his. Not a single day of it, he said, plain and certain. I'd walk through that same fire again, Josephine, and the courtroom after, and every whispered word in that quilting circle besides, if it meant arriving at this exact evening, standing at this exact fence line with you. Some things are worth every hard mile it takes to reach them. He kissed her forehead, soft, and she leaned into him, and they stood there at the fence line along, while as the sun went down red and gold behind the mountains, two people who had been strangers once, bound by a marriage neither had chosen, and had somehow, through fire and forgery, and a 15-year-old grudge neither of them had ever known existed, become something far truer than either had thought to hope for. Think they'll grow? Josie asked, nodding back toward the young apple trees, small and green, and impossibly patient against the darkening sky. I know they will, Holt said. How do you know? He smiled, drew her closer against the evening chill. Because you planted them, and you don't do anything by halves, Josephine Sterling. Never have. She laughed, bright and unguarded, and entirely her own, and they lingered at the fence line, until the cold finally chased them back toward the house, the first of many ordinary evenings still waiting ahead of them that year. Ezra Boone, as it happened, had his own spring surprise brewing, though he kept it close a good, while before Josie caught wind of it. She found him one afternoon leaning on the corral fence, uncharacteristically distracted, watching the road rather than the horses he was meant to be tending. Expecting someone? Might be. He didn't quite meet her eye. Widow name of Sarah Combs, out past the county line. Been writing her some weeks now. Ezra Boone. Josie's whole face lit with delight. You've been courting, and you never breathed a word of it. Wasn't sure there was anything worth breathing a word about yet. He shifted, plainly uncomfortable under her grin. She's coming to look at the new barn Sunday. Said she'd heard good things about the ranch. I'll wager she's heard good things about its foreman. Might be, he said again, ducking his head, and Josie laughed, delighted, and thought that perhaps this was simply what happened. When one long hard fight finally ended, the whole household, the whole ranch, seemed to exhale at once, and every good thing that had been waiting patient in the wings finally found the room to step forward into the light. Sarah Combs did come that Sunday and stayed for supper, and by the way Ezra kept finding excuses to refill her coffee cup. Josie suspected the ranch would have a second wedding to plan, before the year was out. She was right. Ezra and Sarah married, that October, in the same church that had seen so much else unfold that year, though this ceremony carried none of the tension or borrowed dresses of Josie's own. Just a small, warm gathering of ranch hands and neighbors, Reverend Whitfield presiding with visible delight, and Ezra standing at that same altar looking, for the first time in the whole time Josie had known him, genuinely, thoroughly nervous. Never thought I'd see the day, Holt murmured, watching his oldest friend fumble slightly over his own vows. Neither did he, I'd wager, Josie whispered back, watching Sarah's patient, fond smile steady him through it. Afterward, at the small reception held in the Sterling Ranch's newly rebuilt barn, its raw timber finally weathering to match the rest of the place, the whole structure smelling now of fresh hay instead of smoke. Ezra found Josie by the refreshment table and startled her with an unexpected embrace. "Oh, you and Holt both a debt I can't rightly repay," he said, gruff, clearly uncomfortable with his own sentimentality. "Wouldn't have found the courage to write Sarah at all, if I hadn't watched the two of you fight for something worth having, right here on this ranch, these past months. You'd have found your own way to her, Ezra Boone." "Maybe." He tipped his hat, eyes suspiciously bright. "Grateful I didn't have to find out the slow way, regardless." The barn rang with fiddle music long into that October night, and Josie danced, with her husband under lantern lights strung between the new rafters, and thought that this, too, was part of what a hard-won ending was supposed to look like. Not just the fight survived, but the ordinary, joyful, unremarkable celebrations that got to follow after, one by one, for as long as a person was lucky enough to keep living. There remained the practical matter of the water claim itself, and Josie and Holt had spent that same summer discussing it at length, sitting up late at the kitchen table, where so much of this whole ordeal had first been laid bare between them. "It's yours outright now," Holt had said. "You could sell the water rights to the railroad yourself if you wanted." Voss wasn't wrong, that they're worth a considerable sum to the right buyer. "I don't want to sell to a railroad," Josie had said. "I've had quite enough of watching land get treated like a thing to be carved up and sold to whoever offers the highest price, regardless of who it ruins along the way." "What do you want to do with it, then?" She'd thought about the 3 ranchers who'd ridden through the night to testify, thought about her own father and Randall Pruitt's slow, hard-won redemption, and a whole county's worth of families who'd nearly been ground down by one man's 15-year grudge dressed up as ordinary business. "Share it," she'd said finally. "Fairly. The other ranches along that same water table have struggled through the same dry seasons we have. If the claim's truly mine to decide, I'd rather see it used to keep good families on good land than locked up behind a fence just because the paper says I could if I chose to be small about it." "That's a costly kind of generosity, Josephine," Holt had said. "Generosity usually is. I'd rather be costly and right than careful and small." It had taken the better part of that summer to see it done properly. Lawyers and surveyors and careful negotiation with every neighboring family. But by the time Ezra and Sarah exchanged their vows that October, the water ran shared and honest across 6 different holdings, and Larkspur Crossing had begun, slow but certain, to speak of the Sterling Ranch not as the place where a scandal had unfolded, but as the place where, when the reckoning finally came, it had been put right for everyone, not just the 2 people standing closest to the fire. That autumn, Larkspur Crossing held its harvest festival on the town green, same as it did every year, and for the first time in longer than anyone could remember, the whole county turned out united rather than divided by whispers. Elias brought preserves and late-season squash from the ranch's own garden, laid out proud on a table that drew a crowd most of the afternoon. Ezra and Sarah danced 3 dances running, unbothered by anyone's opinion of a foreman marrying above his station, since nobody in that town any longer believed love came with stations attached to it worth minding. Mrs. Bishop presided over the pie competition, with the same fierce authority she'd once used to lead a room's cruelty, now turned entirely toward more generous purposes. And Mrs. Pruitt found Josie by the cider stand, both of them watching Randall, thinner now, humbled, working an honest trade in dry goods, since the bank had let him go, laugh easy, with a group of the very ranchers who'd once testified against him. "He's happier," Mrs. Pruitt said, quiet, watching her husband. "Strange thing to say about a man who lost his position, and very nearly his freedom besides. But he's happier than I've seen him in 15 years of marriage." "Guilt's a heavy thing to carry quiet," Josie said. "Heavier than most any honest punishment, I'd wager. You'd know a thing or two about that, I suppose. Your own father's carried a version of it too. We're a whole county full of people learning that lesson together, it seems," Josie said, watching the crowd, farmers who'd nearly lost everything, a banker's wife finding her nerve, a foreman dancing with his new bride, a father mending a bridge to his daughter, one small kindness at a time. "I don't know that Larkspur Crossing will ever be entirely free of gossip. Small towns rarely are. But I think it's kinder now than it was a year back. I think that counts for something considerable. It counts for everything, Mrs. Pruitt said, and linked her arm, through Josie's easy and familiar, the way old friends do, though they'd only truly become friends this past difficult year. Come, help me judge this pie contest properly. Clara Bishop's grown far too generous with her scoring since she started apologizing for things, and somebody's got to keep the standards honest. Josie laughed and let herself be pulled toward the pie tables and thought, watching the whole warm, ordinary chaos of a county healing itself one harvest festival at a time, that this, far more than any courtroom verdict, was what justice properly done was actually meant to look like in the end. Not punishment alone, restoration, a whole community, slowly, patiently, choosing kindness over cruelty, together. When autumn term finally arrived, not long after the harvest festival, Josie stood in front of a schoolhouse full of children for the first time. Chalk dust already on her fingers, a lesson on the blackboard behind her in her own careful hand. Mrs. Pruitt had come to help her ready the room the week before. An unlikely friendship, the two of them, but a real one by then, forged slow over shared afternoons of mending and garden work and the particular honesty that grows between two women who've each had to rebuild something from cruelty and near ruin. She'd sewn new curtains for the schoolhouse windows, without being asked, plain and cheerful, yellow gingham that caught the morning light exactly the way Josie had once imagined, years back, in a life she'd thought the drought had taken from her for good. Nervous? Holt asked, walking her to the schoolhouse door that first morning, her father trailing behind, with a basket of fresh bread for the other mothers to share. A small, ordinary kindness, same as everything else worth having on, that ranch had turned out to be. Terribly, Josie admitted. I haven't stood in front of a room full of expectant faces since that quilting circle, and that went rather differently than I'd have liked. This room's on your side, Holt said, and kissed her, brief and warm, in full view of the arriving children, and their mothers, unbothered now by whatever Larkspur Crossing might whisper about a rancher kissing his wife plain in public. Same as I am, same as most of this town's learned to be, given the chance to prove it. She watched him go, back toward the ranch and the cattle, and the life they'd built together out of the wreckage of a scheme neither of them had asked to survive, and turned to face her classroom. A dozen young faces, eager and nervous both, waiting for her to begin. Good morning, Josie said, and found her voice steady, sure, entirely her own. My name is Mrs. Sterling, and I'm very glad to be here. A small girl near the front raised her hand, before Josie had even finished writing her own name on the blackboard. One of the Pruitt children, she realized, recognizing the careful, anxious way the girl held herself, so like her mother had once held herself in a room full of judgment. Yes, my mama says you're the bravest lady in Larkspur Crossing, the girl said, solemn as a judge herself. Is that true? A ripple of soft laughter went through the room, and Josie felt her own throat tighten unexpectedly. I don't know that I'd call myself the bravest, she said, honest, crouching down to the girl's level. I was frightened a great deal these past months. Bravery isn't the absence of being frightened. It's choosing to stand up anyway, even when your knees are shaking. I expect your mama's been braver than she gives herself credit for too, more than once. The girl considered, that with the particular seriousness only children manage to summon, then nodded, satisfied, and Josie rose and turned back to the blackboard, chalk in hand, and began the day's first lesson, with a steadiness she hadn't been entirely sure, walking in that morning, she'd actually possess. By the time the noon bell rang, and a dozen children spilled out into the schoolyard for their midday meal, Josie stood alone a moment in the empty classroom, looking at the neat rows of desks, the yellow gingham curtains catching the light exactly, as she'd once imagined years back, in a life that had once seemed entirely lost to her. She thought of a gray morning at her father's kitchen table, and a lamp burning low, and a decision that had once felt like it belonged to everyone but her. And she thought, standing there in a schoolhouse that was at last entirely her own to fill with whatever she chose to teach, that every hard road she'd walked to arrive at this particular Tuesday morning had been worth the walking, every single step of it, however little choice she'd been given in, where the road first began. That evening, walking back toward the ranch house together, as the last light failed, past a rebuilt barn that no longer smelled of smoke, past a garden full of tulips and stubborn young trees, they came at last to a door that had once worn a lock and now, most nights, simply stood open. Not because there was nothing left to fear in the world, but because, at last, there was nothing left inside, that house worth locking a single soul away from. The frost had melted early that year, same as it had the year before, and would every year after. And in the house, where two strangers had once stood in careful, frightened silence, there was, at last, only the sound of two people, who had chosen each other, laughing softly together in the dark.